A Shot-Rolling Ship by David Donachie. Read by Peter Wickham.
Welcome to hell, brother.
The voice under the thick felt hat was gruff, neither friendly nor unfriendly. The face the colour of mahogany, pitted, lined, and weary-looking. The eyes deep pools of brown. It stood out from the rest of the ship's crew only because it was close to a lantern, so that all the others present were but seated shadows, eyes in the gloom sizing up a newcomer.
Happen there are those who told you old Nick's lair was hot and reeks of brimstone. It ain't, friend. It goes by the name of Griffin, and it be cold, damp, and the smellers of bilge and rotten timber.
A voice from the gloom added his opinion.
Pressing this lot ain't going to make it smell any better.
John Pearce, half crouching, lowered the canvas sack that contained all his worldly possessions, the homicidal fury he had felt on coming aboard subsiding into a cold anger. That was underscored by a deep feeling of powerlessness, the natural state of mind for a man ensnared for the second time in a matter of weeks by the tentacles of King George's navy. How could he get out of this? He had to get off this ship, but there seemed no way of doing so short of chucking himself into the sea, and that would only lead to recapture unless, and just as likely, he drowned in the cold grey waters of the English Channel. The sounds above his head were of a ship getting under way, shouts as sails were sheeted home, the groan of strained timbers, the creak of the cables that controlled the rudder. A sudden lurch as HMS Griffin, out of the lee created by the much larger East Indiaman, dropped sideways off the crest of a wave. That forced him to grab hold of a ladder rung, his muscles tensed as the bows hit another wave, sending a shiver through the entire frame. This was happening on a relatively calm sea, which made Pearce wonder what it would be like to be aboard in rough water. He had to acknowledge one speaker, the fellow in the felt hat, to be right about the smell, except he had left out the stench of packed and unwashed humanity, hardly surprising given the lack of space. Pearce had to crouch just to avoid clouting his head on the deck beams. Even if the mass of bodies prevented him from seeing the exact dimensions of his new home, he knew it to be tiny. The deck he'd crossed on coming aboard was that, no more than 20 stretched paces bow to stern, and less than half that dimension in the beam. What lay beneath could not be greater.
Are you to move on, John boy, or are you wishing to leave us to freeze on this here ladder?
Michael O'Hagan's Irish brogue was muffled because he was still standing upright in the well of the hatchway, through which ran a wide, thick-runged ladder. Behind him the others pressed out of the Lady Harrington would be on deck, no doubt watching, as Pearce himself had done moments before, that spacious and steady merchant ship sailing away towards the easily visible southern shore of England.
"Aside there! Let me pass!"
The voice was that of Lieutenant Benjamin Colborne, the man who had just pressed them, sharp and commanding. Rufus Dommett was the one who answered, the shrill voice evidence of both his youth and perhaps a degree of nervousness.
"There is no room to pass."
"Shift, I say!"
"But—"
"Silence! You are new aboard, man, and I forgive this once, such a response as being due to ignorance. But do not in future address me with such familiarity, and do not leave out an acknowledgment of my rank, or I will be obliged to discipline you."
From somewhere in the darkest recesses of the deck came the sound of a loud and derisory mouth-made fart. John Pearce edged forward towards that raspberry, and the men before him, by standing and moving back the barrels on which they had been seated, cleared a space. Michael O'Hagan joined him, even more stooped because of his greater height, mouthing a quiet "Mother of Jesus," as he realized how cramped it was. Behind Michael came Charlie Taverner, still confused, that state of mind rendering the normally voluble Londoner silent. He was bustled to one side as the blue-coated officer squeezed by.
"Move back there, make some space."
The mahogany face spoke again.
Can't make what ain't there, your honour, excepting we stove out some of the scantlings.
Belay that, Latimer.
If Lieutenant Colborne was made angry by the interjection, a vocal complaint from what appeared to be a common seaman, he did not show it. The response had no animosity, more a weariness born of habit. Instead, he turned and commanded the other pressed men still on the deck to come below, which required him to push even more to squeeze them in. He then raised himself onto the lowest rung on the ladder so that he, bent forward, could address an assembly crammed so tight it seemed that only the bodies held each other against the pitch and roll of the ship, and that was with a quantity of the crew absent, for there were men on the deck still sailing the ship.
"Get your sodding dunnage out of my mouth!"
Charlie Taverner, the guilty party, who still had his ditty-bag slung over his shoulder, reacted sharply.
"Happen I would rather leave it gobstopping than smell your breath, mate."
"You'll be smelling your own blood, cheeky bugger."
"Silence!"
John Pearce examined Colborne closely as he issued that stricture, expressed in an absent-minded fashion while he was occupied simultaneously riffling the pages of a book. On the deck of the Lady Harrington, the man, as tall as John Pearce, though thin, had looked imposing. But after only a few weeks as an enforced sailor, Pearce knew that the uniform had some bearing on that. The lieutenant looked less impressive now. Hardly surprising, given that with a book held up to his face and an arm hooked round the ladder upright, he was forced to speak from a position forced on him by lack of headroom, one that robbed him of all dignity.
"By the power vested in me by those executing the office of the Lord High Admiral, it is my duty to acquaint you with those statutes so laid down by them to govern the behaviour of the officers and men of His Majesty's ship at sea."
The voice became a drone in the background, partly for the fact that John Pearce had heard the words before, but just as much because of the dull way that Colborne recited them. It hardly seemed possible that not much more than an hour before he had been discussing how to get ashore on the Kent coast in a way that would allow him to evade notice. Every fibre of his being longed for that. It had, since he had been, 3.5 weeks previously, illegally and violently taken up and pressed for the first time. The image of that night came easily, as did remembrance of the Pelican Tavern, hard by the River Thames, tucked in the liberties of the Savoy, a warren of streets and alleys where minor felons and debtors could live without fear of bailiffs and tipstaffs. Sought by him as a refuge from pursuit by a more powerful law, it had been full of humanity, smoke, laughter and argument, all perfectly normal, until the door burst open and the navy arrived in force, with cudgels and purpose, rudely interrupting his cagey conversation with a quartet of impecunious strangers who made their living on the river-bank. It had led to sudden mayhem and a near escape, but he had not evaded the press-gang. Instead, he had experienced capture and received, at the end of a knotted rope, his first taste of naval discipline. The course of his life had changed in that moment, his only desire to get away and to do so without attracting attention. To get ashore discreetly was essential, for he suspected there was a King's Bench warrant out for his arrest. Obstacles to that aim had been numerous ever since he was taken up, yet he had somehow overcome them all to gain his freedom. But now, having fallen foul at the very last hurdle, he must start all over again. He looked around at the dimly lit faces of his new shipmates, at least those he could see. They ranged from the very young and open, of seamen who were little more than boys, to the man who had spoken to them first, a gnarled veteran who had clearly spent years at sea. There would certainly be people in this tub that would seek to stop him deserting. He had learnt in the last few weeks that a proper sailor's attitude to a pressed landsman rarely included much in the way of sympathy. The best he could hope for was indifference, a stance that would have men look the other way at matters which they thought to be none of their concern. One or two might be positively compassionate, but to balance them in any group there were bound to be those who would interfere from natural malice, men who hated to see others make a gain not vouchsafed to themselves. and that took no account of those with warrants and petty ranks, keen to protect their little shards of authority. Such a thing did not apply to Lieutenant Colborne. He was a known quantity. Having gone to the trouble of pressing them out of a passing merchantman, the ship's captain could be guaranteed to do everything in his power to keep Pearce aboard, so the nature of the man was of serious concern. The officer who had first pressed him, and given him that welcoming clout with a knotted rope, had been a black-hearted tyrant called Ralph Barclay. Was Colborne the same? Was he as watchful, as keen to see his inferior officers use their fists, a starter or the lash, to maintain authority? Chance had allowed him to outmaneuver Barclay and regain his freedom. Could he do the same to Colborne? What of the ship, this HMS Griffin? Where would she sail? What were her duties? She had come up upon the Lady Harrington close to the South Kent shore, in soundings, as Colborne had insisted, a fact that seemingly gave him the right to press seamen from any merchant vessel he encountered. Did her duty keep her in such proximity to the coast, or would she be sailing into deeper water? Soundings. The word had a funereal ring to it, a death knell of hope. A lead line cast into John Pearce's soul not 20 minutes ago would have touched bottom quickly when he realized what was about to happen, realized that, in the end, it was Ralph Barclay who had humbugged him, and not the other way round. As he had contemplated his options, he was in near despair. That, he knew, was a useless emotion, and it was not in his character to dwell in the slough of despond. Now every nerve end was alive, his ears and eyes acute for any clue that would aid his cause. He would get off this ship, or die in the attempt.
Article 4. No man shall have carnal knowledge of any beast carried in his Majesty's vessels on pain of death.
"He has a right way with the jest," whispered O'Hagan, "with no room here to swing a dead chicken. Sure he's fit for the fairground tent. If he was to lay out his hat, I'd toss him a sixpence."
Pearce felt himself smile, which made him realize how tightly clenched had been his jaw. It might be involuntary and the joke feeble, but it eased the angry tension, and he was grateful for the release to a man who in only a matter of days had become a close friend. That was Michael's way, to see humour in every situation, no matter how desperate. Besides that, he had a great flair for deflating those who sought to command him, as well as the ability, gifted as he was with height and strength, to stand toe-to-toe with any man who thought himself cock of the walk. He had faults, all men do, and was bellicose when drunk, the state in which Pearce had first seen him. But if there was anyone he would want by his shoulder when trouble threatened, Michael was that man. The words being mouthed by Colborne were no joke. Articles of war, they called them, those Lord High Admirals. Articles of death, more like, given the number of offences that attracted such a penalty. Ideas raced through John Pearce's mind, split-second scenarios. A long swim, if they ever got close enough to shore. The theft of a boat, or, given that he had money hidden in his ditty bag, a bribe to some of the crew to aid him and get him ashore. So real did these ideas seem that he could almost feel the solid ground of Mother Earth under his feet. The way the ship lurched disabused him of that particular reverie, and it also brought on a stab of guilt as he realized that he was thinking only of himself, ignoring the needs of those who had been taken up with him. That brought forth several emotions on top of self-reproach, feelings he had harboured before. Annoyance at the way these men sought decisions from him, almost forcing him to be a leader, to think for them all when all he wanted was to think for himself. Michael, Charlie Taverner, and young Rufus Dommett had been pressed too, and with just as much brutality. They had shared discomfort as well as adventure, had been threatened, and had stood together. In the giant Irishman's case, Pearce had grounds to believe he owed him his life. He was less beholden to the other pair, but still they had come to think of themselves as a group, the Pelicans, named for the tavern from which they were pressed. On first acquaintance it was easy to consider abandoning them, and he had tried to do so. Then they had been strangers. It would be much more difficult now.
I feel sick.
Cornelius Gerson's whine, so familiar to those who knew him, coincided with a more telling heave of the deck, as a groaning griffin lurched and steadied. Colborne glanced up from his reading for a brief moment before carrying on. If he observed, from his close proximity to the complainant, that this newly pressed recruit was green around the gills, it had no effect. Pearce could not see Gerson clearly, but then he did not have to. The habitual pout on his almost too pretty face was common enough to require no imagination.
"Don't chuck it, mate,"
called the mahogany-faced fellow called Latimer,
"unless you want to lick it back up like a dog."
Don't go down on all fours in front of anyone on this barky, lad, hissed another sailor in Gerson's ear. It will be to some like an invite.
That brought forth one growl of dissent, but mostly suppressed laughter. It was the way Colborne did not react to the interruption that mattered, for it told John Pearce a great deal. He would not claim to know the Navy in the short time of his enforced service, but he had the ability to make and trust swift judgments on people he hardly knew, for he had grown up surrounded by them as he traversed the length and breadth of Britain. This had been done in the company of his father, a well-known radical speaker and pamphleteer. John had watched Adam Pearce harangue, cajole, and control crowds in many a fiery speech, this while his son passed round the hat to get enough coin for bed and board. Rarely had they stayed long in one place, often no more than a day. It had been an unsettled existence in which the growing boy had been frequently subjected to new surroundings, forced to make new friends, as well as to spot quickly those who might be enemies. He was naturally and without consciousness doing that now, but he had one quite specific model against which to match this Lieutenant Colborne, and that was his previous captain. The choleric bastard who had pressed him out of the Pelican would never have stood for such murmurings, nor would his crew have dared to utter them, in the sure knowledge that such behaviour would see them gagged at the very least. So perhaps Colborne was no despot. But was the manner in which his crew behaved brought about by easy familiarity, such as one might find on a happy vessel, or by the man's lack of the attributes necessary to impose a rigid authority? Pearce would know in time, but that thought served only to drive home the truth. That was the one commodity of which he had none, and that in turn edged his task from daunting to impossible. John Pearce had not only to get off this vessel, but to cross a hostile homeland at risk of arrest, and seek the intercession of some of his father's old friends to get the warrant lifted, brought on by a vitriolic pamphlet damning the government, which had forced both father and son to flee to France over 2 years previously. Regardless of the outcome, he would then have to take passage over the very waters on which he was sailing, to land in a country now at war with Britain and seething with bloodthirsty upheaval. He must make his way to the epicentre of the revolutionary storm and bring away from Paris his father, old and probably too sick to travel, then get him back to England. Anyone listening to that outlined would say he was mad, and the man contemplating these thoughts reckoned they would not be far off the mark. "Mr. Short," Colborne called as he slammed shut the list of statutes and returned the book to his pocket. "The muster book, if you please."
Aye, aye, sir."
Pearce looked for the voice and found it to the rear of the companionway, in probably the only person aboard standing to his full, insubstantial height. At first he thought it a youth, but a step forward into a pool of light showed a pallid, lined, adult face and a truncated, squat body dressed in a midshipman's blue coat. He was carrying a large leather-bound book, as well as a lidded inkpot, which he placed on one of the rungs beside his superior, before extracting a quill pen from his pocket. Beside him, Pearce could feel Michael O'Hagan shaking with silent laughter, and it was several seconds before he realized the connection that his friend had made immediately.
"Sure they named him right, John boy. There's barely half a pint of the sod. Jesus, he'd fit in my breech pocket."
Mr. Short will enter you into the ship's books and allocate you the number of your mess. None of you has a rating, and you told me you are new to the service, so you will be entered as landsmen."
"I ain't no landsman, Your Honour."
Colborne leant forward to detect the speaker, his gaze alighting on a sailor from the Lady Harrington who had been forced aboard to make up the number the lieutenant required. The crew of the merchantman had drawn lots, and this poor fellow had lost. Pearce thought of him like that, but had to acknowledge that he had accepted his fate, if not with enthusiasm, then certainly with a palpable degree of equanimity, his main concern seeming to be that any moneys he was due from his merchant service, as well as news of his impressment, should go to the right place. The man was a sailor by profession, always liable to be taken up by the press gang, and so perhaps accepted what had happened to him as just one of the hazards of that occupation.
"I shall be rated able, Your Honour. I can hand and reef for the best of 'em, and I ain't no slouch in the tops either."
"Name?"
"Little John, Your Honour."
"Mr. Short, enter Little John here as able."
It was not only Michael who got that one. The whole crew began to laugh, some of it suppressed sniggering, in a couple of others less controlled, outright guffaws. Pearce was taken by the way Colborne reddened in undisguised embarrassment, since it gave him another clue to his personality. He too saw the pun and was brought to the blush by the fact. A quick glance at the midshipman showed the pained expression of someone who had been many times in his life the butt of such jokes.
"Carry on,"
Lieutenant Colborne mumbled, before spinning round to make his way, hand over hand, back on deck. Book held in one hand, Short had entered the able seaman, his next act being to point his quill at Pearce, who stepped forward and gave his name in a loud and clear voice. He could feel rather than see the reaction of his fellow pelicans, and he was close enough to Cornelius Gerson to note a look of disappointment that his action engendered. Such a response was understandable given the way he had tried to protect his name the last time this had happened. On being mustered into Ralph Barclay's crew aboard his first ship, Pearce had refused to give a name for fear that it would expose him as a possible felon. That subterfuge had not held. His real name, if not his reasons for withholding it, had soon become common knowledge.
"That was bold of you, John boy,"
Michael opined, just after he had entered his own name, soon to be joined by Charlie Taverner and Rufus Dommett, who made the same point. Gerson, who joined the cluster, said nothing, just looked at him with deep suspicion. Being naturally untrustworthy himself, he would only see deep subterfuge in what was, to Pearce's way of thinking, common sense. And quite possibly Gerson had harboured a notion to use his knowledge for some advantage. For himself, of course, he not being given to thinking of anyone else.
"Call it a benefit of experience,"
Pearce said, dropping onto his haunches to relieve the strain on his back, the others doing likewise. "I think we erred aboard Brilliant in the way we sought to fight not just Barclay, but the whole crew." Given that he had caused most of the trouble, it was Pearce's turn to feel a tinge of embarrassment, as he observed Michael, Charlie, and Rufus agree in their various ways. Cornelius Gerson's expression did not alter, and a hard look from Pearce made him move away, for he was not really part of their group, having arrived in the same situation as them after being fished out of the River Thames. Experience since then had taught all of them to mistrust him, and never to discuss matters of import in his presence. Once he was gone, his three companions looked at Pearce with eager expressions, which brought forth a resurgence of his previous annoyance. What was it about them that they gave way so easily to his notions, even Michael O'Hagan, who would fight anyone taking the least liberty? It had been like that almost from the first. They made out that they wanted to get free of the Navy just as much as he did himself, yet seemed incapable of forming any method for doing so. Right now, the looks he was getting forced him to continue. "They were not all bad aboard Brilliant, were they? There were some good men among them." "None that I saw," snapped Charlie Taverner. Pearce knew he was wrong, and was sure Charlie did too. It was only his natural bluster that had him denying the truth of what was being said, For some of the men on the frigate, if they had not been helpful about the Pelican's deserting, had gone some way to alleviate their discomfort. One or two had gone further than that, and told Ralph Barclay in no uncertain terms that on one occasion, in the article of punishment, he was coming it too high. "We must get some of the crew on our side," Pearce continued, "or at least to act towards what we aim to do with indifference."
"I doubt there's many of them,"
said Charlie, not willing to concede an inch.
"To my mind, these tars are bastards to a man."
"Amen to that," added young Rufus, who tended to follow Charlie in most things. Pearce's response was terse. "Then let us at least lull them into not paying us too much attention. Look at Little John and Gerson." The sailor was sat on a barrel, hugger-mugger and chatting away to his new shipmates, no doubt looking for places and people that would make a connection, for the men of the sea were like a tribe. Cornelius Gerson, all tousled fair hair and gaucherie, was grovelling in front of another group, headed by Latimer, which was his way, trying to ingratiate himself towards some kind of advantage. Hard to imagine in so crowded a space, but Pearce and his trio of fellow pelicans had already managed to isolate themselves. "You!" The finger, poked really hard into his shoulder, made Pearce look up, though he did not have to go very high to find himself in eye contact with Midshipman Short. Close to, the lines on the pasty face were more obvious, but it was hard to tell if the fellow was prematurely aged or suffering from some affliction that made him appear so. "Quit your lazing about. You're not aboard your merchantman now. There's work to do, so get moving." The last word was delivered with another hearty jab of the mid's finger. The temptation to poke a fist very hard into that face was almost overwhelming. Indeed, John Pearce's right hand had balled ready to do so without conscious effort, and he felt, as he always did when tempted to physical violence, the tremors that affected his body. But he forced himself to smile, and even touched his forelock as he responded in a meek voice, "Aye, aye, sir." Not reacting to the cry from the masthead of HMS Brilliant gave Captain Ralph Barclay a small frisson of pleasure, particularly since his young wife, Emily, had looked up sharply from her embroidery at the muffled shout of "Sail ho!" Muffled because of the need to penetrate the closed skylight above their heads. He enjoyed demonstrating to her the authority he held, one that did not oblige him to respond immediately to everything that happened aboard ship. Let others do that, then report to him if they, given what they observed, thought it necessary. There was another feeling in his breast, that being relief. The sighted sail would be one from the convoy he had been tasked to escort from Deal to Gibraltar. 57 ships he had deserted in the face of standing Admiralty orders to pursue a single French intruder, in a way that could only be called, even in the most benign interpretation, a pursuit for personal gain. The knock at the door was anticipated. The person who entered when commanded to do so, his acting first lieutenant, was not. What was he doing undertaking a task that was properly that of the lowest midshipman? Henry Digby removed his hat in the regulation fashion and tucked it under his arm, nodded to the top of Barclay's lowered head before turning to add a small bow in the direction of his wife, that acknowledged with a sweet smile. Her husband felt another frisson, this time less pleasant, thinking that Digby could only have come below personally to afford himself a chance of such an encounter. The thought made him speak in a sharper tone than he intended. "We have come upon our charges, Mr. Digby, I assume?" "No, sir. Our lookout reports a 3-masted vessel. We think a bark." "Not the convoy?" Ralph Barclay tried but failed to keep any hint of anxiety out of the question, and even if he had achieved that, the way he suddenly raised his head slightly to look at Digby directly, he was sure, gave him away. "Flag?" "None flying, sir." "Course?" "The same as our own, sir. We're coming up dead astern of her." "What do you recommend?" Digby was surprised by that. Ralph Barclay was not a consulting captain, even when, as in this case, the answer was obvious.
closing with them, sir, and obliging them to identify themselves."
"Then make it so, Mr. Digby, and inform me when they are hull up so I may take a look myself."
Emily spoke as the door closed.
"Young Mr. Digby seems to be settling well into his task, husband."
There was a temptation to question the use of the word young, for there was little difference in their ages. If anything, Digby might well be slightly the senior of the two. Odd that someone only approaching her 18th birthday should use such a word. No doubt it was the married state that allowed for such condescension.
"He had better, my dear. It hardly looks as though his predecessor is going to make a swift recovery."
Emily threw him a look of sympathy then, for even if he would not admit to it, even if she was unsure of the true cause, she knew her husband to be worried. The events of the past week had seen his mood swing dramatically, starting at exultation when they had first sighted a French privateer, a potential prize, switching dramatically as he had been humbugged by a superior sailing vessel. Fury as that French dog had snapped up one of his charges, albeit one that was laggardly, and carried her into a seemingly unassailable berth. The losses the ship had suffered in finding out the meaning of impregnability had been frightful, and only a stroke of what seemed to Emily like pure luck had saved matters. During that period, the ups and downs, Ralph Barclay's aura of husbandly superiority had suffered, and his wife had discovered that she had no need to be meekly obedient to his every whim. She had found, to her surprise, that she had power in their relationship, that he craved her good opinion, and was cast down if that was withheld. Discovery of such a thing had been heady, but Emily knew that whatever strength she had must be exercised sparingly, and never more so in allusion to recent events. In short, she could not be open and merely ask him outright to voice his disquiet. Concern over Digby's predecessor, the badly wounded Lieutenant Roscoe, lying pale and silent in the surgeon's berth, was unlikely to be the cause. That she did know, for her husband disliked the man, and had made no secret of it even before the recent action. They had exchanged high words on deck about certain decisions, and it was quite possible that a recovered Premier would demand a court-martial to clear himself of whatever slights Ralph Barclay chose to put against his name. Uncertainty as to the true cause of these anxieties deepened the furrows that already creased her brow. Ralph Barclay could not face what he interpreted as a pitying look, and for the umpteenth time that morning he opened the ship's log and examined the loose sheets of paper he had stuffed in between the pages. These listed HMS Brilliant's true position over the last few days, facts which he was reluctant to commit to the book, for once written up they could not be altered. One thing could be entered certainly, the removal of that damned pest John Pearce and his band of malcontents. The thought of Pearce made his blood boil, the palpable arrogance of the man, the way he had, by insubordination, driven a wedge between himself and his new wife, and even worse, engaged the sympathy of the whole ship's crew against its lawful captain. That he had shown courage and resource in salvaging the bind that Ralph Barclay had created for himself was small recompense. He had taken the same occasion, the sending home of the East Indiaman Lady Harrington, to rid himself of his wife's nephew, a useless young man who was, without doubt, cowardly to boot, thus removing another potential source of marital friction. The beauty of that manoeuvre was that he could make it look as though he was showing the boy favour. The other loose papers were less cheering. Not for the first time he damned an Admiralty, specifically Lord Hood, the man actually running the Navy, for saddling him with a set of officers who were strangers. Such a thing made life hard, for he could never be certain that the loyalty he had built up from men he had brought on in the service himself was there in the men imposed on him by Hood. The wounded Roscoe was a case in point. Argumentative, unable to smoke his captain's methods and preferences, forever questioning orders, showing no faith in those he was obliged to obey. He had demanded a court-martial after a particularly high-worded spat the day before the action in which he had been wounded. Ralph Barclay tried hard to suppress the hope that his Premier would die of his wounds, his Christian beliefs fighting a hard and losing battle against self-interest. His anxiety to catch up with his convoy was many-layered, not least the mere fact that it was quite possible to miss them completely, even if it did consist of over 50 ships. The ocean was vast enough to hide an armada. Roscoe was a problem that he could do nothing about. If his premier recovered, it would mean trouble. If he expired, his complaints about his captain would go with him to the grave. A quite different but related problem presented itself in the case of Davidge Gould, the man who commanded the sloop HMS Firefly, the second protective vessel tasked to escort the convoy to Gibraltar, a ship he had quite deliberately cut out of the chase and the subsequent action. He would have Gould aboard as soon as he joined, with his own ship's papers, including Firefly's log, which, no doubt, would have been kept scrupulously up to date. Then, and only then, could he decide what to put in his own, facts about courses, times, and positions that would make his actions appear in the best light. At some time in the future, this book before him would end up at the Admiralty, and there was just a chance that some clerk, emerging from his habitual torpor, might cast an eye over it. So a little obfuscation would be necessary. Not downright lies, for that would be too obvious, but just enough to ensure that should the two logs be read together, the facts would not too obviously jar. That was something of which he could be reasonably confident. The idea that such Admiralty clerks were eagle-eyed defenders of the nation's needs was, Ralph Barclay knew, a myth. They were idle, claret-swilling placemen, more interested in their salaries, pensions, and postprandial naps than in the misdemeanours or minor peculations of naval commanders. They would sit, these logs, along with the Pearce's accounts and myriad other papers, gathering dust, very likely never subjected to more than a cursory look. But should someone in authority in the future wish him ill, and seek for something in his background with which to damn him— Another sharp tap stopped that train of thought, as Midshipman Fairmelow, tall, fair of hair and gangling, knocked and entered. "Mr. Digby's compliments, sir. The chase is hull up."
"Chase, Mr. Fairmelow? I was not aware that we were engaged in one."
Fairmelow knew better than to respond.
Mr. Digby wished me to add that it's odd, sir, that they don't seem to have smoked we're in their wake."
Ralph Barclay sat forward, suddenly all attention.
"Say again?"
"Well, sir, if they have lookouts aloft—"
"Which they must surely have."
"They're not looking over their stern."
Ralph Barclay got to his feet and called for his hat. "From which we can deduce, Mr. Fairmelow, that their attention is on something more tempting."
"The convoy, sir."
"Precisely."
The atmosphere on deck, the air of tension, told the ship's captain that everyone on watch, down to the ship's cat, had drawn the same conclusion. The midshipmen, normally content to remain snug in their verminous berth, were visible, as was the master, Mr. Collins. Even the little surgeon, Lutyens, had come up and was now deep in conversation with Digby. That ceased as soon as his presence was noted, with everyone coming to attention and raising their hat. A glance aloft at the sail plan told Ralph Barclay that his previous instructions, to crack on, were being obeyed. A glance at the slate told him that HMS Brilliant was making 8 knots on a steady wind that was coming in nicely over her starboard quarter, and a current that was aiding her passage. Taking a telescope from the rack, he trained it on the ship in whose wake they lay, a bark, as he had already been told, with a low freeboard and clean lines. Most obvious was the fact that she had reefed her mainsails, that she was not sailing at anything approaching her full speed.
"Mr. Digby, I hope we have a weather eye out for French warships. I would hate to make the same mistake as our friend yonder."
"We have that, sir, and since we are due west of Brest, I've given orders that one of our lookouts, on the mizzen-top, should pay particular attention to that quarter."
"Good."
"Do you anticipate French warships?" asked the fish-eyed surgeon, Lutyens, in his high-pitched voice.
Everyone else stiffened. You did not question a captain on his own quarterdeck, and certainly not one as tetchy as Ralph Barclay. It was common knowledge that Lutyens knew nothing of the sea or naval life, just as it was common knowledge abaft the mainmast that his powerful connections ashore were such that it was a wonder he had chosen to serve in the navy at all, never mind a lowly frigate. It was that which saved him from a bad-tempered blast. For a man with little interest to aid his career, Ralph Barclay needed to be careful with one who had so much that he could decline to employ it. The telescope never wavered, though the voice was far from friendly.
"The French Navy may be in revolutionary ruin, Mr. Lutyens, with most of its competent officers fled or dead, but there are still men who can sail and fight their vessels. It is also the case that these are their home waters, and Brest is their main naval port, so it behoves me to be aware of the threat."
Lutyens whipped out a little notebook, one that he carried everywhere, much to the annoyance of all aboard, and did what he always did, scribbled some note in it. Many aboard had speculated as to what that book contained, and thoughts amongst the crew of pinching it and getting someone to read its contents were commonplace, for all were convinced it could not be laudatory. Brilliant was close enough now to see the tiny figures on the bark's deck, all crowded in the bows on the weather rail. Ralph Barclay had no doubt that they were French, another privateer out on the hunt for an English merchant vessel. He had a sudden vision of the way the one he had previously pursued had humbugged him, not once, but 3 times. That, and other considerations, made him act.
"I would wish to alter course slightly, Mr. Collins. Take us inshore a trifle. I want this fellow left with only the option of the open sea and an unfavourable wind when he wakes up to our presence. Mr. Digby, a word to the lookouts, if you please, to cast their eyes well beyond our friend yonder. From our higher masts we shall be able to pick out the convoy before we overhaul him."
"Sir." One nimble young mid was sent aloft with the message, while Fairmelow was dispatched to inform the captain's wife that there was something of interest for her to see. Her coming on deck, well wrapped in a hooded cloak, coincided with the slight alteration of course, which meant adjustment to the yards to take full advantage of the wind. It also coincided with someone aboard that bark casting a look over the taffrail, for their deck was suddenly a hive of activity as the reefs came out of her sails and her speed increased markedly.
"Deck there! Sail due south! 2 sail! More!"
"Our convoy, my dear," said Ralph Barclay as he took Emily's arm. "And between us and them a French dog waiting for nightfall to sneak in and snap up one of our charges."
"Chase has altered course to starboard, and he has hoisted a French flag."
"That means he is heading out to sea, my dear, into the wind and away from his home shore, hoping to outrun us. Perhaps even that some French warship is in the offing to aid him."
"I can barely make out what he is doing, husband."
"Mr. Digby, I wish you to fire off one of the forward cannon."
That got him several discreet sideways glances, for they were well out of range of the bark.
"No ball, just powder, and keep firing. Let us alert those ahead of us to the presence of an enemy. If Captain Gould has his wits about him, he will put up his helm to investigate, which will give our friend yonder something else to think about.
Now, Emily, my dear, let us see if I can help you to master this telescope."
"Is this the time, husband?"
"None better, my dear, given that we have something for you to look at."
Everyone wanted to observe this event, for this was a gentler Ralph Barclay than they knew. But only Lutyens, with no notion of the discipline required on board a ship of war, had the ignorance to openly stare as Barclay put his arms over his wife's shoulders and admonished her to steady herself against him and his well-spread legs to master the roll of the ship.
"Now, put this to your eye, so, and your hand to the front part. Then twist and extend it till the image becomes clear."
"Sea and sky, husband, is all I can manage." Ralph Barclay put his head very close to that of Emily, so as to point the telescope in the direction of the chase, delighted with the squeal of pleasure that told him, however briefly,
that it had appeared in view. He could smell his wife's musk, the odour of her body as a sliver of warm air escaped from under her cloak to fill his nostrils, and leaning against him as she was, with her body resting on his, induced a natural tumescence. He was aware of the attention their joint posture engendered, and took pleasure in the jealousy of those surreptitiously watching them.
"We shall have him before nightfall, my dear, especially if Captain Gould brings Firefly into play."
The anxieties which had assailed Ralph Barclay in his cabin faded. The problem had not disappeared, but luck had presented him with an opportunity to palliate his second-in-command, the man who, barring the wounded Roscoe, could most threaten his position. Situations where lieutenants like Roscoe fell out with their captains were endemic, and a bane that the Navy suffered with reluctance, given that it was usually one man's word against a superior officer, with courts of fellow captains inclined to support the senior man. That was not the case with a man who ran his own ship, even if he too was only a lieutenant. The word of a master and commander would count as near equal. In short, he would be listened to with great attention. Gould would hear the cannon fire. Nothing carried at sea so much as that booming sound. He would come about to investigate, and together they would snap up this fellow trying to run from them. A share in a prize, a bit of hard coin in the purse, was just the thing to persuade another officer that whatever actions had previously been undertaken by Ralph Barclay, however questionable they had seemed at the time, could be justified. For a man who held that fate had, throughout his life, been less than kind to him, Ralph Barclay, with a wife 17 years his junior in his arms, on the deck of his own vessel, envied by all aboard, and in pursuit of an enemy he was certain to catch, felt just for once like the luckiest fellow in creation. There was little drama in the capture. It took time, for the fellow kept running tack upon tack as far as he could. Collins brought HMS Brilliant around and into the wind with something approaching efficiency, which pleased a captain who harboured ambitions to be in command of a crack vessel. Quiet suggestions from Ralph Barclay adjusted the sail plan in minor ways that made the frigate sail easier, if not perceptibly faster. The wind, now coming in over the bows, blew back his wife's hood, ruffling her long, loose-worn hair, and all the while her husband clutched her close and helped her fiddle with the telescope. The Frenchman, judging by the streaming jets, had started his water barrels and was pumping like mad to get it over the side and lighten his ship. Well aware that he was at the apex of a losing triangle, the other ship's stores followed, and finally the small cannon, trunnions and all. Pop guns, really, designed to threaten rather than destroy, but telling in their weight nevertheless. But there was one thing he could not chuck over the side: the numerous crewmen any close-to-shore privateer must carry on board to take and sail into harbour a number of enemy merchant vessels. The idea that he might shift them into his boats and abandon them, which is what Ralph Barclay would have done, disappeared as his cutter and jollyboat were cast adrift to float away on the current. Davidge Gould in Firefly had reacted as Ralph Barclay knew he must, coming about to investigate gunfire that might be in some way a threat to the convoy. In doing so, he would have espied both the chase and Brilliant's topsails, and deduced what was obvious. The frigate cut the French privateer off from the shore. He must deny him a southing, his best point of sailing on the present wind, and force him to the open sea. He would also quickly smoke that it would be his ship, a better sailor on a bowline, not Brilliant, which would effect the capture. Content that all was in hand, and that nothing of import would happen for some time, Ralph Barclay and his wife could safely retire to their cabin in some privacy.
"Lucky bastard,"
said one of the sailors close to the surgeon. He was not addressing Lutyens, but a fellow tar.
"Every manjack aboard horned up, and Barclay's the only one that can ease it."
"It is a matter of some curiosity to me," opined Lutyens, to no one in particular, "that sailors who from their conversation and behaviour when ashore are a salacious bunch, do not travel aboard in quantity the means to assuage their lust. It would be better if half the crew were females." That got him several looks, not all benign, for he was an anomaly on board, every bit as unusual as the captain's wife, overqualified for his post, always prying into matters that were held to be outside his province, a stranger to the ways of the service, and scribbling in that little book that was ever with him. Those looks were sharply curtailed when a grinning sailor responded. "We do, your honour. Ain't you never heard the term all hands to the pump?"
"Belay that," barked Digby, "and get on about your duties."
Lutyens heard the parting shot as the fellow replied softly,
"There you go, mate. Only sinners aboard reside before the mast. It's all saintly purity in the gunroom, with hands clasped in prayer."
"Mr. Lutyens," said Digby, coming close enough so that only the surgeon would hear him, "it does not do to excite the crew." Lutyens, surprised, looked even more like a fish than usual, his eyes larger and that thin curled hair blown back by the breeze. "I was not aware that it was I who excited them, rather that it was the captain's clear intentions towards his wife. As to the means of release which that fellow alluded to, it is to my mind an activity to be heartily recommended. I myself employ it frequently, as I'm sure you do." Digby's cheeks were red from the wind. The deeper reddening that suddenly suffused his face had nothing to do with that. A half-hour later, Berkeley came back on deck alone, keenly examined by everyone who could look at him without being observed, though only the good Lord could say why, for there was no discernible change in his appearance. He picked up his telescope, trained on the quarry, then said,
"Bow chasers, Mr. Digby."
"Sir?" The order being passed on, Digby asked, "Do you wish to clear for action?"
"No, the fellow has ditched what little armament he has. A couple of shots over his bows should bring him to."
"Might I recommend we issue some muskets, sir?"
"The marines have sufficient, Mr. Digby. Let's get them up into the bows so our friend yonder can see what's coming."
Firefly must have been waiting for the senior vessel to fire. As soon as a ball from Brilliant left the frigate's larboard chaser, a great plume of smoke was seen to blow away from the other escort's bow.
"Well, this fellow is no hero," snorted Berkeley, as the tricolour flag at the masthead of the ship they were pursuing was immediately run down. "Not even a musket shot for his honour."
The routine aboard Griffin swiftly assumed a familiar pattern, learnt in only a week aboard HMS Brilliant, reminding John Pearce just how much such custom was one of the tools by which authority dulled thoughts of liberty in men who were not sailors by trade. The naval day was fixed by the tasks they had to perform, the naval week by the irritation of repetitive food and the odd ceremony like divine service. The other method of control was exhaustion, for moving any sailing vessel from one place to another was hard physical work, made worse aboard this ship because no amount of habit could inure a man to sleeping in the cramped circumstances which pertained aboard an armed cutter, a state of crowding that made life aboard a frigate, with 28 inches of space and the odd bump into a nearby body, seem like slumber paradise. Proximity to his sleeping neighbours had forced up the sides of his hammock, so that Pearce had felt himself to be in something like a tomb. He could feel the effect that ran down both sides of his body, which had been crushed between two others as the ship pitched, rolled, and snubbed on every wave, the groaning of the timbers almost human in their tone of complaint. His neighbours, judging by the muffled cursing which occasionally emanated from their hammocks, had suffered as much as he. Pipes blew at the opening of the naval day, in darkness, to rouse the watch off duty to quit their hammocks and stow them. A ship of war in time of conflict stood to every morning before dawn, boats over the side, ports open, and guns run out as the light increased sufficiently to allow the captain to see a grey goose at a quarter-mile, really to ensure that no enemy had snuck up close to them during the hours of darkness to gain an advantage that could see the ship taken. Sure of an empty sea, the guns were housed, flintlocks removed, the shot replaced in their garlands, cartridges and priming quills returned by scampering powder monkeys to the gunner sat behind his thick canvas fear-naught screen, the standby slow match doused, and the crew set to commence the cleaning of the decks, a task carried out eagerly because only on completion could they be piped to breakfast. Food was another tool of authority, for if it was to many unpalatable stuff, it was regular, plentiful, and in the case of HMS Griffin reasonably fresh, got up by a cook that had to work on a jury-rigged stove that could not be set up until the captain was sure the ship was safe, the planking underneath his pitch the first to be cleaned. Such regular food was not gainsaid to a toiling labourer ashore, a fact of which sailors were wont to remind each other, as though somehow just having a square meal was a blessing. For the Pelicans, the comfort of their own table, which they had enjoyed aboard the frigate, was not vouchsafed to them on Griffin. Little John, allotted to them as the leader of their mess, tallied off a pair to take the mess kids and fetch the grub, but it was eaten where a space could be found, some choosing, even on a calm but chill morning, to take their victuals on deck rather than squeeze into the stifling hutch that passed for the crew's quarters. At the rear of that, guarded, outside mealtimes and sleep, by a marine, a canvas screen cut off a space roughly 1/3 of the whole lower deck for the two mids and the captain. Pearce, looking along the deck beams above his head, calculated that while there was more space per body, there was no luxury aboard for officers either.
"Gunner's coop is in there and all,"
said Latimer when Pearce asked about it.
"Berth's opposite where the mids and the captain's steward squeeze in, afore Colburn's screened off Buffy, and he don't half come it high and mighty, 'cause he has his private space jeering at the other warrants. Puts a plank o'er his powder barrels and calls it a bed, 'cause there ain't the room to sling hammock. He's a squat house, is the gunner. Have to be to get a wink."
"I don't know where you're sitting, brother," said Michael O'Hagan, "but I have scarce the space to swing my elbow." Another voice spoke, one whose face was well hidden by the crowded sailors.
"Happen God was having a special jest when he put you aboard this barky, Paddy. Might be he wants to cut you down to size."
"Christ, blubber!"
exclaimed another unseen voice to a ripple of laughter.
"He's near the size of you. Man could cut the bog-trotting bugger in two and he still wouldn't fit."
Pearce, sitting very close to Michael, sensed his body stiffen and saw the way his face closed up. The Irishman was not averse to being called Paddy as long as he granted the person naming him so the privilege, but he was dead set against anyone assuming the right.
"The good Lord might have put me here to shut some gobs that need it, and to gather a few teeth to sell whenever I get ashore."
"Easy, friend," Pearce whispered. It would hardly aid things if the Irishman started belting folk, for he had hams for hands, and they would do serious damage. O'Hagan ignored the attempt at restraint, his voice holding no humour now.
"And if I can't find room enough to swing me elbows, I will be chastising and laying out 4 at a go, which will not bother me at all given the time it will save."
Charlie and Rufus had stopped eating, like Pearce, waiting to see if anyone would take up the challenge. There would be hard cases aboard, just as there were in every group of gathered males at sea or ashore, men who commanded others with their fists. Michael had been obliged to deal with the bully called Deverneau aboard Brilliant, and he was obviously quite prepared to do the same here. All it needed was for someone to declare themselves willing to accept the challenge. No one spoke, though Pearce observed some members of the crew throw glances at one or two of the larger specimens, men who might have laid claim to respect prior to the arrival of these latest crewmen. Those in question seemed very intent on eating their food, so it was Michael who broke the silence.
"Now you will find me Paddy enough to break a smile and laugh at a joke, and maybe even want to give a helping hand to a struggling fellow. But I will have the proper regard I am due from all here."
The canvas screen was pulled back, and Lieutenant Colborne, hatless and with his coat undone, appeared, ranging his eyes over the crowd.
The canvas screen and the one behind it would have done little to muffle Michael's loudly proclaimed statement, and the hard look in his eye was designed to tell all present that he would not tolerate violence. "Mr. Short," he said, addressing the hidden midshipman, "with the sea state being so gentle, as soon as the crew have finished their breakfast, we will carry out practising boarding from boats."
"Christ in heaven!" hissed Michael as Colborne turned away, steadying himself against the roll of the ship. "Gentle," he says. "Is that blue-coated fool resting his pins on the same bit of wood as me?"
Colborne, back now to the crew, the canvas screen still held up in one hand, stopped dead. Given that he had come out to the sound of Michael's voice, he could hardly be unaware of the source of the comment, even if it had not been made out loud. Pearce reckoned that to call a ship's captain a fool when he could hear and identify you was a dangerous thing to do. Michael liked to debunk people, yet this time he might have gone too far. But the screen dropped as Colborne disappeared. That was when Pearce looked around and observed that none of the crew, at least those he could see, had been holding their breath. "He takes a tease well," he said to Latimer.
"Ain't bad, old coal barge," Latimer replied, "as captains go."
"Who's coal barge?" asked Rufus.
"You don't look too bright, lad," Latimer replied, peering into the heavily freckled face and the light blue eyes. "So it'll be a bit of a reassurance to know that you is thick after all."
"Not thick enough to be a sailor by trade," snapped Charlie Taverner, leaping to the defence of his young friend. Latimer responded with a slow smile, designed to take the sting out of what could turn into an argument.
"Coal barge be the captain's nickname, and as I say, he's not a crabbed one. Christ knows I served often enough under worse. Dislikes the cat, which is a bonus, but there are those aboard, like there be on any commission, who give occasion to deserve it."
"Then how does he maintain discipline?" asked Rufus. "I thought all captains were friends to the lash."
Pearce was just about to point out that the best way to control men was with consent, but Latimer's swift reply left that as no more than a thought in his head.
"The right way, mate. He gets we's to do it ourselves. He's a bugger for stopping the room of those that gets out of hand, and the old crew if they don't mend their ways after the warning. Done it twice for a 2-day stint already this commission, which don't do him no harm. Lines his pocket a bit, that saved rum, his being a ship's purser as well as captain."
"Is that usual?" asked Cornelius Gerson, always quick to join a conversation that connected in any way to money.
"Never in life. But where on a ship this size would you put a robbing bastard of a purser that would see him and his stores safe? No, the powers that be have gifted the captain the job. Happened to make up for him having such a ship boasting otherwise. He ain't as bad as the natural breed, but I doubt he'll come out of the commission showing a loss."
Pearce almost asked outright if he was aboard a happy ship, or even a contented one, for what Latimer had been saying had elicited nods from those closest to them. But the old sailor, dark-skinned face closing, carried on.
"Can't say I blame him, being fair. Ain't coal barge's fault that we's crammed like sardines in a barrel, with not the proper room to eat and sleep. That'd be the fault of those who reckon this a ship fit for the duty, which it is plainly not."
"The duty being?" asked Pearce.
"To protect ships like the one you has nabbed off, going in and out of their own ports. Griffin ain't no flyer, which she needs to be to catch Johnny Crapo, but as sure as hell won't freeze, they ready come out from their own ports in laggards, and the sight of us and a deck full of cannon is enough to have them put up their helms and run for home or safety. And putting double the hands aboard ship don't help neither. Looks a good duty on the face, this here patrolling the sea lanes lark, and it would be if we could take one or two."
"Prize money?" said Gerson, with a familiar and avaricious gleam in his eye. "Fat chance," sneered a man between them. "The workhouse more like when peace comes. We's been out here near a month, barring a trip past week to revictual, and though we might have seen plenty, the only thing we's ever got alongside is some Dane or Hansa merchants, which being neutral ain't no use at all." Pearce was not looking at Latimer or the speaker, but at the rest of the crew, at least those he could see, nodding vigorously in agreement, or shaking their heads in wonder at the foolishness of an admiralty that had sent the wrong ship on such a vital task.
"And to think we signed for this without a press gang inside," Latimer added. "Bugger's got a full complement without so much as a cuff round the ear."
Charlie was quickly onto that. "If you're volunteers, why press us?"
"Replacements, mate. We fell foul of a frigate going south short on numbers. Captain of that bugger whipped half a dozen men out, prime seamen too, which tells you all you need to know. We's at more risk from our own in these waters than them French sods. They could press me out of this bugger any time."
Pearce recognised the voice that had spoken up to rile Michael, a heavy-set but fleshy fellow called Blubber, who might have been one to challenge the Irishman. In looking for it, he observed very clearly that it was a statement with which a great number of the crew also agreed.
"The Med will be teeming with well-laden Frenchmen," said another sailor. "The buggers that went will be lining their pockets in the weeks to come." "As well as warm with it, Matt," said a third, "with room to sling a habit for a decent night's kip." "And drop an anchor at Majorca," Blubber added, "so it will be warmer still when the senoritas are boated out." The buzz of general conversation broke forth, for there was nothing like carnal anticipation to get a group of tars talking. But beneath the happy anticipation, or tale-telling, of Mediterranean beauties lay a clear discontent. These men had signed up to this ship for the prospect of quick prize money, no doubt on the promise that it would be easy. It always was on any poster John Pearce had ever seen. They would have accepted any hardship in food and space for enough of that, and the dream that went with it, of a prize so valuable, or captures so numerous, that they could live in comfort for the rest of their lives. Latimer had turned away to continue his talking with one of the men who had joined with him, allowing Michael to speak softly to his fellow pelicans. "Well, there's consolation, we being miserable, that we might not be the only ones."
"We'll fit in right nicely," opined Rufus Dommett, getting a slight raised eyebrow from his mates, for the boy was not one to put an opinion above the parapet.
"Mr. Short,"
called a voice from beyond the screen,
"I think it's time to pipe all hands on deck."
"Heard us moaning," said Latimer softly, turning back to them. "But she should too. Reckon he thought this a duty that would see him in clover just like us. Happen he believed what he had printed on his posters just as we did. Well, it's only right that if we have the hump, he should know it."
Not a happy ship, thought Pearce, on either side of that canvas divide.
"That ain't gentle, is it?" moaned Rufus, trying to steady himself while looking unhappily at the endlessly moving grey-green waters of the English Channel.
"He must be joshing us," Charlie replied, jabbing a finger at the choppy waters.
"No sight of land," said Michael, "nor the smell of it."
Pearce had already spotted that, but he was more attentive to the way a call for duty had tempered the moaning so evident between decks.
Whatever discontent these men harboured was laid aside as soon as they were given something to do. Those given the task hauled in the ship's boats, which had been towed behind, covered with tarred canvas to keep them dry, sent over first thing after they were piped from their hammocks, for there was no room on deck to do anything if they were inboard. You could not work the guns or clean the deck, lest they were sent astern. "Line them up, Mr. Short," Colborne called. "Then send them aft for their weapons."
The second midshipman, a stripling called Bailey, stood with the burly marine, wooden swords, dummy hatchets, and padded clubs at his feet, two others holding muskets to their rear, as his messmate walked along the lined-up sailors, saying, "Attacker, defender, attacker, defender." Before he got to him, Gerson, unseen, nipped round an indifferent sailor to ensure he got the deck. Standing next to Michael, Pearce got the boats, while the Irishman got the defence.
"Look at the Irish, for them boats is set to be damned uncomfortable."
"I'll try to make this deck uncomfortable for you, Michael."
"Don't trouble, John boy. It is enough that already."
Still in the same line, they trailed the few feet to where Bailey and his marine stood, those early enough given the choice of weapon. Pearce took a sword, and in weighing it, he realized that were it real, not wooden, he was close enough to the ship's captain, provided his weapon was sharp enough, to sever his neck with one swift blow. What would happen then?
Probably the musket-bearing marines would lower their weapons and shoot him. But what he could observe did bring home the notion that a disgruntled crew, inclined to rebellion, would have little difficulty in taking the ship if they so wanted, a quartet of marines being insufficient to stop them. He called to mind his reading of William Bligh's published narrative of the Bounty mutiny, how easy it had been for Christian and his fellow conspirators to take the vessel. Really, like Bligh, all that Colborne had to protect him was the authority vested in him by his officer's commission, and the threat of punishment that hung over any sailor who mutinied. He had a vision of casting this lieutenant adrift in one of the boats. At least he was close to home, unlike Bligh, who had to sail 4,500 miles to find a civilized landfall.
"Move along there,"
the lieutenant said, and for the moment it took for Pearce to obey, their eyes locked, Pearce holding the look for longer than discipline allowed so as to annoy Colborne. The expression to which he was treated showed him how well he had succeeded.
"Defenders to the lee rail," called Colborne. "Attackers to the weather. Mr. Short, take on board your grappling irons."
Charlie Taverner had to push Rufus so that he went to the right bulwark. As soon as he spotted Pearce moving in the same direction, the boy joined him.
"I ain't looking forward to this, Pearce, having seen the way those boats were heaving about as they was hauled in."
"They will be a little more stable, full of bodies, Rufus." The voice was tremulous as he replied,
"What if I tumble overboard?"
"Then you have a choice, Rufus. Swim for the ship, or stay afloat till you are dragged back in." It was telling comment of the youngster's naivety that he seemed to give the twin notions due consideration. Then he brightened.
"You can always dive into my rescue, you being a right good swimmer."
"You got gills, Pearce?" asked the sailor stood the other side of Rufus. The face was friendly, bright blue eyes and a broad winning smile under blonde, near-white hair. Pearce responded in kind, eager to address the first crew member, barring Latimer, to call him by name. "I'm a shark, mate, so if you tell me what you'd like for supper, I'll slip into the water and fetch it for you." "Name's Sam, mate, and I's partial to a bit of cod." "You'd be too far south for that, Sam," said the man on the other side of him. "Water's too warm." "I'd like to hear you say that, Matt, if you was dipped in it."
"Mr. Short," Colborne shouted, "to command the cutter. Mr. Bailey, the jolly boat. Tally off the men you need."
The sailors preceding Pearce and Rufus dropped into the boat with commendable ease. Getting over the side was not so easy for either of them, though the former did not make as much of a pig's ear as the boy. Lowering yourself, even if only some 10 feet, on a single rope wet from sea-water into a boat bobbing 4 or 5 feet up and down with a wooden sword dangling between your legs was not easy. While Pearce dropped into the boat with a thud, Rufus practically fell in from his second handhold, dropping the padded club he had chosen as a weapon in the process. "Anybody still see that Indiaman, lads?" asked the sailor called Matt. "For we'll be wanting to send these arsewapes back." "No need," came the reply. "Next man of war comes along, we'll ship them out in that." "Not if I get first in line, you won't," replied Matt. "I'll have my ditty-bag shouldered and a foot over the side before they gets hull up." "You!" commanded a voice behind Pearce. "Sit here. Somebody get hold of Ginger and get him holding something before he tips into the briny, and make space for the first boarders." Order was swiftly applied, and Pearce found himself holding the thick end of an oar, the wood wrapped with twine to aid his grip. The space between him and the opposite oar was quickly filled by those who would board first. Looking towards the stern, he was facing the prematurely lined face of Midshipman Short, who had taken station on the tiller. "Haul away!" he shouted, much louder than was truly necessary. Pearce could not claim to be efficient on an oar, though the commodity was all around him in the ease with which the true seaman hauled away, but he had competence enough to outstrip Rufus, who could not get his blade into rhythm with the others, it being in the water when theirs were out and vice versa. "We's all out of kilter," cried one wag. "Ginger is showing us how." "And when we shall gift him a short blue coat and call him Mister."
Midshipman Short deliberately looked away at what was an obvious reference to the general uselessness of his kind.
"Miss more like, the useless bugger."
One of the men set to board took pity, and using only one hand, got Rufus dipping and raising in unison. "You just watch the back of the man in front, lad. Go forward with him and drop the blade, then haul back hard and lift when he does. Never mind the oar. That'll do what your body says it should if you hold it right." Rufus did not get it right, but that mattered little, given that they were not going far from the side. They turned to face the ship, oars now used to steady the cutter. To their left, the smaller jolly boat lay likewise bobbing on the green water as wave after wave ran under the counter. Short passed the tiller to one of the spare sailors, and with some difficulty made his way to the prow, where, transferring his own dummy sword to a wrist lanyard, he gave the command to "Haul away!" The boats moved forward, gaining speed quickly, oars in and out before Rufus or Pearce had got their sticks into the water. When they did manage, they aided progress very little, as the boat headed for the side of HMS Griffin, the deck of which was now lined with their shipmates yelling and swearing a blood-curdling invitation.
"Mr. Bailey," Short shouted, "you take the main chains, and I will assault them amidships, thus splitting the defence."
Quick to obey, the oars on one side hit the water while the others were lifted, and the jolly boat was sent towards the bow. Pearce, craning over his shoulder, could see little until they came off the crest of a wave, and not much then. The ship wallowing, the side lined by those still aboard, yelling and screaming. But he did reckon that what they were about against a real enemy would be hazardous in the extreme. All advantage lay with the defenders, who had height and bulwarks to protect them, while those in the boats had nothing but a few muskets to keep the crew away from the side of the ship. Done for real, it seemed like a good way to get a boatload of sailors killed. Both Pearce and Rufus failed to react properly when the command came to boat oars. Luckily Pearce was on the seaward side, so did himself no harm, merely trailing a useless oar in the water. Rufus' stick clattered into the ship's side, and jumping out of its rowlock, sent him flying into the bottom. There, as everyone else aboard reached for the ropes that hung from the now thrown grappling irons, he was repeatedly stood on until Pearce could get to him and haul him to his knees. "Come on, Rufus! Time to show them our mettle!" Not all the sailors were using ropes. A couple had their backs to the ship's side and, hands cupped, were propelling their mates up towards the deck. The way the boat was dipping because of this sent both Pearce and Rufus off balance, and they were the last to the side, the only people in the thing, except those tasked to keep it pinned in place, faced with a series of lines and the command, delivered with a scream, that they climb them. The grappling irons had been thrown into the ship's shrouds, high enough so that anyone using them could get above the level of the deck. Pearce took hold, looped one end round his hand, and jumped so that his feet were on the scantlings. Lying almost horizontal, he hauled himself up hand over hand until he reached the ladder of ropes that ran to the mainmast cap. There was a brief moment in which he could observe what was happening on deck, as men who were shipmates fought each other with real gusto. The false weapons were swinging hard, and the odd punch was being added to what was a joyous melee. Looking aft, he saw Colborne smiling at what was happening before him, taking no part in the actions of his men, but enjoying their mutual pounding. Disinclined to join in the fighting beneath him, he saw no reason why the ship's commander should be spared active participation, should be left to enjoy his sport. Dropping down onto the deck, he found himself standing over Cornelius Gerson, who was cowering, hands over his head in the scuppers. That earned him a sharp jab from Pearce's wooden sword, which brought forth a pleasing squeal, which Pearce followed up with a telling kick that sent Gerson's head into the ship's side. But dealing with Gerson nearly did for him. Spinning round, Pearce just got his sword up on time to stop himself being hit with a soft sand cosh, the wood of his blade taking his assailant on the forearm, which must have hurt, for his face screwed up in pain and the eyes took on a look of alarm at what was sure to follow, a clout round the ear. "Sorry, mate," he called as he slipped by, looking for Michael O'Hagan,
who would be bound to be in the thick of things. The Irishman was not hard to spot, standing near the ship's wheel, head and shoulders above those trying to contest the deck with him. He had eschewed a weapon and was merely fending off his attackers, one of them the blond fellow called Sam, with his huge open hands, causing no pain and laughing out loud, calling to them to come at him again. Pearce's sword was required again, this time to fend off a fellow with a similar weapon. The sailor clearly thought himself a swordsman, for he took on a fencing posture. That lasted only a second as Pearce, who had been properly taught, whipped his weapon up, slid his underneath, and jabbed him in the solar plexus, a blow that, winding him, had him doubled over on his knees. Pearce tapped the lowered head as he made his way towards Michael, who, spotting him, called out, "Come on, John boy, and see if you can better these spalpeen fools, not one of whom is of any use in a scrap." The truth of that was in the way that Michael managed both to say those words and continue to fend off 4 men. "Michael," Pearce said, coming close, weaving and ducking as his friend tried to slap him, "I want you to fall away slowly, as though we are driving you backwards." One of the things Pearce liked about the Irishman was the way he reacted to a request without demanding to know why. He had done so before on more than one occasion, and he did so now, making it look as though Pearce and the others were besting him. They, not aware that Michael was only pretending, got bold, which earned the blonde Sam a head-wringing clip. "I'm going to push you, Michael, and when I do, I want you to fall back until you hit something." Pearce got a huge, open-handed slap on the forehead that stopped him dead, giving him some idea of how much O'Hagan could have hurt him if he so desired. "As long as it's not solid, John boy." "No, brother, it's as soft as you sometimes are in the head." Michael grabbed Sam and his other attacker, one in each hand, and lifted them bodily off their feet. They still tried to club him, blows which, when they landed, made the Irishman laugh. "How can you say that and me not even had a drink?" "Now!" shouted Pearce. Getting both hands in between the struggling pair, he gave Michael the heaviest shove he could manage. O'Hagan, laughing even louder, staggered backwards at increasing speed, taking his assailants with him. Colborne, who had not really been watching those right before him, instead looking beyond to see how Bailey and his party were faring in the bows, was slow to react. Michael's back hit him 4 square, and the combined weight of the trio knocked him right over to land on his back on the deck. His body tripped Michael, and he and the others fell in a heap behind him. Pearce, yelling blue murder, had the pleasure of standing on and pinning to the deck his commanding officer as he repeatedly jabbed his wooden sword. Having dispatched Michael in dumb show, he stepped off Colborne, put his wooden sword to the other man's neck, and looking directly at him said breathlessly, "I think we might have taken the ship." Then, with just the right length of pause to rob his accolade of any truth, Pearce added, "Sir."
"Welcome aboard, Captain Gould, on what I think you will agree is a most providential day."
Davidge Gould, dripping water off the hem of his boat-cloak, raised his hat as the whistle blew to pipe him on board, surprised that someone as tetchy about prerogatives as Ralph Barclay should have come on deck in full uniform to greet him. He was, after all, only a titular naval captain as opposed to a real one. A rather small file of marines, with no sign of a marine officer, stamped to attention as his foot hit the deck, making him feel as if he were the superior, and vastly so, while Barclay was the junior. It was all a bit much, especially since he had not come voluntarily. Gould had been ordered aboard, cursing his commanding officer on receipt of a summons that obliged him to cross from his own ship to this deck on a stretch of sea disturbed enough to ensure he arrived damp.
"You know my acting premier, Mr. Digby."
"Good day to you, sir." Acknowledging Henry Digby begged several questions, not least his acting rank, and the absence of 2 of HMS Brilliant's more senior lieutenants. That added to the observation Gould had already made that there was no marine officer. Looking for damage, he could observe none. The frigate was in all respects sound. Full of curiosity as to why such men were missing, he was obliged to observe the courtesies and reply to Berkeley's opening remark.
"It is a most auspicious day, sir. The sun not only shines on the sea around us, but on our endeavours."
It sounded crass in his ears, pure hyperbole, but it clearly pleased Berkeley, who positively beamed at him.
"Nobly said, Mr. Gould, nobly said. Mrs. Berkeley has prepared us a decent dinner. You are already acquainted with my wife, are you not?"
"I am that, sir, since you were gracious enough to introduce me when she arrived in Sheerness. We last met at the Assembly Room dance the night before we weighed."
"Quite. Captain Nelson informed me that you were most attentive."
Berkeley's tone had changed as he uttered that, being close to a growl, and Gould got the feeling it was inadvertent, because his superior suddenly, in a forced manner, smiled again.
"You boarded the prize, Captain Gould. Is she as fine close up as she looks from here?"
Both men turned to look over the ship's side at the bark they had just taken, wallowing on the waters of the Bay of Biscay, alongside Firefly. Beyond that, the sails of the Gibraltar-bound convoys spread over the horizon.
"Oh, she is a splendid capture, near new. Her name is Chantenay. I have taken the liberty of ordering my Premier to stay aboard, pending your approval, of course." "Make it so, Mr. Gould. How was she in the article of hands?"
"Stuffed to the gunwale, sir, so much so that I was at a loss to know where they all slung their hammocks."
"Then I will have some of those bodies aboard brilliant, if I may. I am deuced short-handed, as you well know, and I'm afraid to say, in the recent recovery of the Lady Harrington—"
"Recovery?"
"The ship was taken, Gould, and by that very French dog you saw me chase.
But you took her back." If Berkeley was disturbed to be so rudely interrupted by a junior officer, he did not show it. Truly, Gould thought, this is a different creature to the one I first met at Sheerness.
"I did, as it was my duty."
Berkeley looked hard at Gould, then, as if challenging him to disagree.
"As I was saying, the action was not without loss, so let us get some of those French dogs on board so they can haul on a rope and earn their keep. You may take some on board yourself, which will create room for your prize crew, and relieve the anxieties of your Premier that so numerous a body of men might try to take back the ship."
"I am to provide both my Premier and the crew, sir?"
"Why, of course, Gould. Do you not deserve it? It would have been a damned difficult capture without you coming to my aid. I would have struggled to take her before nightfall in a stern chase."
Berkeley, having delivered what Gould thought a palpable exaggeration, turned towards the doorway to his cabin, with his guest tripping in his wake.
"Mr. Digby, you have the deck. Signal Firefly and the prize to resume their course. Captain Gould's vessel to take station at the front of the convoy."
The smell of food wafted into Gould's nostrils as they passed the steward's pantry, and he had a brief sideways glimpse of chafing dishes sitting in hot water to keep warm the food inside.
"Shenton, Captain Gould's cloak."
As his steward obliged, Berkeley added,
"See that it is brushed and dried, will you, and send someone to relieve Mr. Gould's coxswain of his ship's papers. I will look at them after we dine. Now, Gould, a glass of champagne."
"Thank you, sir." Emily Berkeley entered from the side cabin as her husband was pouring the wine, giving Gould a radiant smile that made his heart beat a little faster. She was a beautiful creature, clear skin set off by naturally rouged cheeks and bright eyes under a mass of shiny auburn hair. He could remember the touch of her hand as she had danced with him at the assembly rooms the night before they weighed from the Nore, as well as the gaiety with which she had undertaken the various routs and reels. With her husband away in London, it had been possible to indulge in a little raillery. Perfectly innocent, of course. One did not try to seduce the wife of a fellow officer. But more fun than if dour Ralph Berkeley had been present. Davidge Gould knew he was not alone in wondering what a young beauty like Emily Berkeley was doing married to a curmudgeon so many years her senior. "Captain Gould," Emily said, "it is good to see you again." He took her hand to kiss it, feeling the cool skin,
smelling the attar of roses she used as a gentle fragrance.
"And you, Mrs. Barclay, might I be permitted to say the sea air obviously suits you. I swear if it is possible you are blooming." "Champagne, Gould!"
Turning to face his superior, Davidge Gould was made very aware, by a rather pointed look, that flattering the man's wife was not a good idea. Barclay handed a second glass to his wife.
"And you, my dear." Picking up a third glass, he raised it. "Let us toast the success of our voyage, which, though troubled, has till now been equally blessed."
The toast was made in loud unison, accompanied by a wine that had been chilled in a bucket lowered into the sea, one which Gould observed held more than one bottle.
"I say, sir, this is very fine. Might I ask the name?"
Barclay acknowledged the compliment to the wine, but threw his wife a somewhat curious glance.
"Supplied by the house of Ruinart, which I dare say will be deuced hard to come by now that we're at war with the makers. We have to thank Mrs. Barclay for it being available to serve."
The words, "as wise in choice as you are beautiful in the flesh," formed in Gould's mind. He was prudent enough to leave them there.
"The same will apply to the food we eat, all chosen by my wife from the very best chandlers in Sheerness, though I think she would acknowledge that she had some assistance from quite a few wives of the other officers."
Those cheeks rouged by the sea air deepened a tad, with Emily Barclay declining to meet her husband's eye, leaving Gould with the impression that he was witness to some private dispute between them. Whatever it was, enlightenment did not follow.
"I think we should eat, don't you?" Barclay said, "for I am sharp set. Nothing like a bit of powder and shot to give a sailor an appetite, eh?"
Gould sat down, wondering at Ralph Barclay. His moods had, in the space of seconds, swung from being hearty to being grizzled, then back again. The thought occurred that dining at this board he had better be on his mettle.
"Fish soup to start, sir,"
said Shenton, as he led in a group of sailors, neatly dressed in checked shirts, with red bandanas tied round their necks, one placing the tureen on the table, the others taking station against the bulkheads. The steward, a lugubrious-looking fellow with bent shoulders, took station behind his captain.
"The fish are fresh, of course, Gould, but the stock is a concentrate from that newly opened shop in Piccadilly. What is it called, my dear?"
"Messrs. Fortnum and Mason, Captain Barclay."
"That's the fellows. Used to be valets to the king, you know."
"Indeed."
"Bit of a come-down, what, from flunkying at Windsor Castle to being mere shopkeepers?"
"I'm not sure, sir, that service in the royal household is such a good billet.
I had the good fortune to attend a levee at Windsor Castle in the company of my uncle, and the way the royals treat their servants would make it a good place to seek volunteers for the navy."
Barclay had frowned again, but whatever was troubling him was not reflected in his words.
Maybe you're right, Gould. What with Farmer George dipping in and out of being batty."
That topic carried the conversation on. The king's disturbed mental state, in abeyance now but always threatening a recurrence. The difficulties that presented to a government trying to prosecute this new war with France with an opposition, and an elder son, the Prince of Wales, desperate to force a regency. That subject was treated delicately, for it touched on politics, and it was a tenet of naval life that there were two subjects best avoided in a ship at sea, the other being religion. The tureen was removed, to be replaced by a whole turbot with dishes of anchovy and lobster butter, lemons, and a tub of horseradish.
"I am agog to hear of the retaking of the Lady Harrington, sir." "A bloody affair, Gould, very bloody."
The story Barclay told was succinct, very noticeably and unusually so, for naval officers were not noted for brevity when recounting tales of actions in which they had participated. This explained, as he concluded,
"You will forgive me, Gould, for not covering all the details, but my dear wife has heard it all before, and the casualties were heavy."
"I noticed the absence of several persons on coming aboard, sir, but one does not like to remark on such matters."
Quite.
Lieutenant Roscoe lies in the surgeon's berth, added Emily. We pray to heaven that he will come back to full health.
Berkeley's voice suddenly became angry.
That damned Frenchman humbugged me, Gould. Not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Seeing Emily frown at the sudden, bitter tone, Gould interjected to lighten the mood.
But it ended successfully, sir, did it not?
Aye,
but the losses bear down heavily upon me.
Your attitude does you credit, sir.
It is hard to see it so,
snapped a surprised Ralph Barclay, for he had been meditating on how such losses could affect his career, not on the actual people who had suffered injury and death. Emily Barclay immediately stepped in to change the subject. Captain Gould, you are, I believe, from Wiltshire.
Discussions of family, localities, and the foibles of locals kept the conversation flowing through the courses that followed, which were of a consistently high standard. A fricassee of sweetbreads, followed by a leg of mutton with currant jelly, onion sauce, salad, and potatoes. Likewise the wines were splendid, a fine white Burgundy from that bucket of cold sea-water to go with the fish course, and a very decent claret with the meat and cheese, that followed by a Chateau Yquem to accompany the sweet plum pudding, which Emily Barclay was keen to inform their guest was entirely the idea and creation of the ship's cook. It was a meal fit for an admiral. The cloth was drawn, and Emily, who knew her place, rose from the table to leave the men to their affairs. "That was a damn fine dinner, Mrs. Barclay," said Gould, half out of his chair. "Had I known you were such a dab hand at provender, I would have engaged you to provide my own stores." "Have a care of your purse, Captain Gould, for my wife is a dab hand at disbursement, too."
"I thank you for the compliment, Captain Gould," said Emily, her face set. "I have to admit to a certain amount of nerves, this being the first occasion on which Captain Barclay and I have entertained. Such a pity that I did not get to know so many of the ship's officers before we lost them."
"Then I am flattered,"
Gould replied, aware that there had been a rebuke to her husband in her words. "If you will permit, husband, I think I will go and sit with Mr. Roscoe."
"My dear."
Both men half stood as she left, Barclay saying as the door shut,
"She reads to him out loud, but I doubt the poor fellow can hear."
"If anyone can stir some life in his breast, sir, I'm sure it is Mrs. Barclay."
"That's an odd notion, Gould. Personally, I put more faith in the surgeon. Though he is such an odd fellow, I would be forced to qualify any confidence. Now, let me oblige you with a more fulsome account of the action."
Which Ralph Barclay did. But it was not the truth. It was a version highly edited to flatter him and his actions, while at the same time diminishing the activities of someone else, especially a pressed seaman called John Pearce, and the useless midshipman, his wife's nephew Toby Burns, an account he could never have delivered with Emily present. The main deck fell silent as she emerged, book in one hand, nosegay in the other, each sailor stiffening in whatever pose he held, except those immediately encountered, who all touched a forelock as she passed. Emily had, she knew, to move slowly, so that word of her presence could spread ahead to the areas of the ship that were very much the preserve of the crew, this to avoid embarrassment to men who might well be partly or wholly undressed, or indulging in some activity they would not want her to see. It had been explained to her by other naval wives who had sailed with their husbands as the blind eye, a quite conscious attempt to avoid embarrassment, not confined to women, but used by officers to avoid inflicting an endless stream of punishments for minor infractions of the far too comprehensive regulations which governed life aboard ship. Sailors diced and played cards, both forbidden. Sometimes they fought, well out of sight of anyone in authority, or got together in combinations to discuss grievances, and that left out women smuggled aboard and practices never mentioned in polite conversation. Petty officers who lived in close proximity to their fellow crewmen had authority over them, but had to show sense in how it was applied,
for it would never do to be overzealous when a body thrown overboard at night would be lost forever. Strictly speaking, her own presence aboard was forbidden, but admirals had been captains once and knew what to see and what to ignore. A ship was a world apart as soon as the anchor was fished and catted, governed officially by the Articles of War, in truth presided over by her husband, who had much say in how such rules were applied. The only plain fact, explained to her, was that they could not be applied in total at all times. Otherwise the captain would have more of the crew in chains than he would have left to sail the ship. The smell of the forward main deck, sweat, unwashed clothing, the animals in the manger, with trapped flatulence added to the stench of the bilge water, was one Emily knew she would never get used to. Not even the nosegay she pressed to her face could overcome it. The odour grew overpowering as she made her way down to the white-painted orlop deck, to where there was barely enough air to keep the flickering flames in the lanterns. The surgeon's sick-bay was a screened-off space only big enough for a cot and a stool to sit on, the lantern slung close to both providing the only illumination. Lieutenant Roscoe lay there covered by a blanket, pale of face, eyes closed, breathing slowly but regularly. He had suffered from an affliction of the face before being wounded, which gave him, because of half his features being immobile, a palsied look. He had also expressed himself in an abrasive manner, though that was in part due to the poor relationship he had had with her husband. In repose, hovering between life and death, that had disappeared, to be replaced by a look of serenity, and it was possible to see the child he had once been. But she could never look on his face without recalling the cockpit on the night of that raid on Les Ardrieux. So many wounded had come back, and she had elected to aid the surgeon and the gunner's wife in treating them. Emily was no stranger to death. In the company of her mother she had visited enough blighted hovels in her native part of Somerset, a duty imposed on her by her station in life, to be upset by the sight of a cadaver. In her time she had seen innumerable dead bodies, women expired in childbirth, or parents prematurely aged by toil and deprivation, and had come to look on them, if not without emotion, at least with some sense of equanimity. Children were harder, little wasted bodies, some yet to reach a first birthday, always evoked tears. But the cockpit had not been like that, had not been silent grieving. It had been blood-soaked and noisy, with men screaming in pain, and the surgeon, Lutyens, shouting to the sailors holding them to get a grip as he set to with razor-sharp knife and toothed saw to amputate a limb, an act he was able to carry out in under a minute, be it a shattered leg or an arm. More quietly he had worked on those, like Lieutenant Roscoe, who had been wounded by musketry, picking gently at the cloth taken into the wound by the ball, using a clear spirit which smelt of herbs to cleanse the wound. It was only an interlude, for even a comatose body reacted to the long probe he inserted to seek and remove the lead, with Emily required to keep the hole clear of the flowing blood so that he could see what he was about. The world of quiet prayer over a deceased soul had no connection to such mayhem, yet it was pain and death, just as it was in a household struck by cholera, or the misery of a stillbirth. As ever, before she began to read, Emily said a quiet prayer for the recovery of the man in the cot.
"Mrs. Barclay, you are here again, your sainted self."
"Hardly that, Mr. Lutyens, just a captain's wife doing what she sees as her duty."
"May I offer you some coffee?"
"That would be most appreciated."
Lutyens exited to instruct his assistant, the loblolly boy, to have made and fetch back some coffee from the gun-room, then re-entered his sick-bay, looking down with an acute degree of concentration on the lovely face of Emily Barclay. Unlike everyone else aboard, his interest was not carnal. He had a lively curiosity about most things, but most particularly about the project which had brought him aboard the vessel. his desire to study sailors in conditions of both normality and extreme stress, to discern the motives by which they lived and accepted the privations of the service, their attitude to death and discomfort. In short, to compile a survey on what made sailors the kind of people they were. Unlike most medically trained men, he found the physical side of his occupation dull, one amputation much like another, a dose of pox cured repetitive, the wrenching of a tooth boring. What interested Lutyens was the mind, to him the seat of all activity and emotion. He had come aboard this frigate because the size made close observation possible. In his coat was the book, one of a number, in which he scribbled what he saw, every detail of shipboard life, and how each member of the crew felt, what they said, and how their words differed from their true emotions. There were notes on Captain Barclay and his officers, and there were observations on Emily Barclay too. The way she had interceded on behalf of the pressed seaman Pearce, caring little for her husband's wrath. What had caused that? Was it a sense of justice, or something more primal? He longed to know, but he was astute enough to be aware that asking would get him no information. Not that it mattered. Lutyens worked on a different set of principles, believing that human beings often told you more by what they omitted to say than by the words they uttered. Captain Barclay is regaling Captain Gould with the story of the recent action. I dare say it is already embellished, Lutyens replied. The frown that engendered pleased him, for it was not entirely disapproval, more an acknowledgment that what he said was bound to be true. You did not wish to stay and hear it told? Emily looked at her book, to avoid the probing eyes of the surgeon, made uncomfortable by his all-too-obvious scrutiny. I dare say I shall have ample time in my life to hear it. I cannot help but feel the role of Pearce and his fellows will diminish in direct proportion to those of others aboard the ship. He meant her husband, but did not say so, and was pleased at the almost infinitesimal reaction, a tiny jerk in her frame at the mention of John Pearce, for he had suspected he had seen her, on the first day she could have observed him, openly admiring him. What would happen if he told her what he knew about the man, the secrets regarding his parentage which Pearce had spilled when drugged with laudanum, of the letter he had written to aid his cause once he landed in England? It was tempting to speculate, but that was all it could be, for the oaths of his profession bound him to silence. The arrival of coffee broke the mood, and as he poured for her, he observed the look of pity that she gave to the still comatose Roscoe. I believe your father is a chaplain to the royal family. Lutyens' letter changed the subject. Doing so confirmed how uncomfortable she found the previous one. He is, but only in the Lutheran faith, which the Queen, being German-born, is wont to practice more than His Majesty. Even if he were to desire it otherwise, he must be seen as the committed Anglican. Surely there is not much to choose between them. You are right, but do not ask me to enumerate what those differences are. I am afraid I find the whole subject of religiosity and its variations baffling. Would you think me too bold if I said that many wonder at your being aboard such a ship as HMS Brilliant? Lutyens smiled, well aware of the curiosity his presence had engendered. You mean with my connections? Not many surgeons can boast of proximity to royalty. She looked at Roscoe again. I am sure he would be grateful if he knew. Perhaps, though I think the notions of a king's power to heal untenable, and my connections too tenuous to be worth much. Will he live? The longer he stays as he is, the better his prospects. Then Lutyens tapped his head. But really, the answer lies here. Surely the answer lies in his heart, not his mind. How can it be when he is comatose?
"Are you a student of Rousseau, then?" the surgeon asked, his countenance amused. "Not a student, Mr. Lutyens, but I have read him. I judge from the way you posed the question that you have too, and that you do not agree with him." Lutyens just smiled. To explain, to dispute Rousseau's romantic twaddle and cite other philosophers in his arguments would mean advancing too many of his own personal theories, and that in turn might alert this lady to the area of his interest. Ralph Barclay perused the log of HMS Firefly with a growing sense of gloom, and thanked the Lord that he had sent a well-oiled Gould back without them in his own barge. He had insisted that his junior finish the port, so that he was not obliged to have the author sitting opposite him as he read. Where Barclay wanted equivocation, there was clarity. But at least, even if he had raised questions about the business of the Lady Harrington, the man had not actually damned him outright in ink. Notes were made so that his own log would bear some relation to what he was reading, for just as he had a right to demand Gould's log, Ralph Barclay would face the same demand from the admiral commanding at any station where he dropped anchor. HMS Griffin on deck was little different from below. There always seemed to be too many bodies for the available space, made more so by the rigid division that the quarter-deck was the preserve of the ship's officers, the only exception being the men at the wheel. To give such a grand name to such a pocket-handkerchief of space, and to determine it as the dividing line between officers and men, was a joke.
"We needs the numbers," Latimer explained, "'cause the buggers we come up against have likely got even more aboard. Hanging off the gunnels when they set forth, light on stores and never out for more than a 2 week, looking for easy pickings. Best time to catch 'em is when they've taken a few. For having crew to capture a two, they're down to bare bones themselves."
Latimer, being right chatty, was a source of useful information, so Pearce sought as often as possible to work alongside him. Engaged in blacking, the largest cannonballs allowed time for talking, and the sound of others chipping the rust off those being made ready to paint made such a conversation discreet.
"Dozens of the sod there are, weighing from the likes of Dunkirk and St. Malo."
"And they make enough captures?"
"Must do, mate. Stands to reason, or they would give it up. I ain't saying that sometimes they don't return home empty-bellied, but this stretch of water be the busiest in creation, what with the number of D-pulls a carrying trade up to London, and the Navy has only so many barkies like Griffin to try and stop 'em. And they ain't fussy about the neutrals neither. They'll leave the crew into a boat and tell 'em to whistle for any redress, the buggers. And like us, hamstrung from the outset, with the captain liable to be had up for laying a finger on a ship that ain't French."
Pearce did not want to hear about that. "Must be chancy, then, if you come up on privateers well manned." Latimer paused in his blacking to grin at Pearce, using one hand to pat the squat cannon by which they were standing.
"They ain't got what we've got, mate. Pop-guns is what they carry, like most of the cannon we has aboard. But this here beauty and the other 3 like her are serious meat and no error."
Pearce looked under Latimer's hand at the squat weapon. The carriage was fixed to the deck, and the trunnion had runners for the recoil instead of wheels. The whole turned sideways on to the bulwarks to increase the deck space. The short barrel and bulbous shape made the whole assembly look innocuous.
"Our friend here is called a carronade. She don't fire a ball very far, but as you will see by what you has in your hand, they be big buggers, and of a weight that can tear the guts out of anyone we encounter. Not that we want to rip them asunder, mind. Not much in the way of prize money to be had from a ruined hull. Let us get close enough is all I ask, and one shot from this bugger placed right in a spot that does for the rigging, or a nice slice of bulwark, will see them cut down their flag damn quick."
Gently, trying not to be too obvious, Pearce steered the conversation to time spent at sea, the home port, and what lay beyond it. Latimer answered his questions without seeming in any way to discern the reasons Pearce had for asking them. That was until the last one, when, having provided the information, the sailor added,
So now you know all you need to run, I reckon.
I
Join the rest of the crew, mate. We all has thoughts of that from time to time. Never met a tar who didn't. And naught that has happened on this commission has gone away to rooting them away.
Bosun,
called Colburn from his precious few feet of quarterdeck.
pipe the hands to dinner.
So, John boy, asked Michael O'Hagan, how are we faring?
This was said as he squeezed an elbow past Pearce to get at the food on his plate, a question the import of which the man on the receiving end well understood. The others leant forward eagerly, but a flick of Pearce's eyebrows indicated Little John. He was too much of an unknown quantity to talk in front of openly, so Pearce waited until he had finished his dinner, at which point he moved away to find the more congenial company of proper seamen. Gerson, bored by the continued silence, followed in his wake, forcing his way into another conversation. "Notice anything about the food we've been eating?"
"It's good,"
replied Rufus, a youth who seemingly had no palate, quantity being his sole criterion for satisfaction. At least the Navy could not be faulted on that.
"Not good,"
snorted a more discerning Charlie Taverner,
"but at least it's fresh. The bread is yet to go mouldy green."
"This tub has been out of harbour less than a week."
"So?"
demanded Michael with palpable impatience. It was one of the traits in Pearce he least appreciated, the way he strung out his answers to simple questions, and he allied that to the honesty to say so.
"Will you give over with the flippant teasing?"
Pearce was not to be rushed, for he was thinking as well as talking. "What room do they have aboard for storage, Michael?"
"Precious little,"
the Irishman replied, using a powerful elbow again to ease himself some space.
"Seeing as they don't have room for us. Sure, it's a ship for leprechauns."
"No manger either, no chicken coop on deck, and no real depth in the holds. That with a crew that is twice the number this ship would carry in a time of peace, which added together means they cannot stay at sea for any great time with so many mouths to feed." "How long?" asked Charlie, quick to see the logic. "According to Latimer, 3 weeks out will put us on short commons," Pearce replied, moving forward to whisper. "Where do we touch land to refittle?" "Place called Lymington. It's a port at the bottom end of the New Forest." The blank stares that greeted that remark reminded Pearce that none of his fellows had led the truly vagabond life that he had endured, trailing around with his father. Michael had travelled a bit, digging canals and the like, but Rufus knew only his native Lichfield and the bits of the capital he had seen as an apprentice leather worker and an absconding one. Charlie had never been outside the parts of London where he made his living on the edge of legality, the rookeries of the city and the string of roads that led west to the Strand and Charing Cross, where the chances of finding a flat were greatest, a country bumpkin who could be parted from his money. From what he knew of the South Hampshire forest, which was not a great deal, it was pretty barren and uninhabited, a place that lived mainly off its timber and provided space for hunting. That was what Pearce had been thinking about as he talked. A wooded expanse, sparse of people that, given the very nature of its resources, would have shelters in which woodcutters and hunters could lay up, and game in abundance to feed their bellies, as well as the kindling to cook it. He could only hope that once they were away from the shore they would be safe, and he did know for certain that the forest stretched north to a main road between the west and London. There was a double attraction. It was a place he could possibly part company from this trio, somewhere they would be safe and allow him, alone, to go about his own affairs. Quietly, in a whisper that could not be heard outside their tight little circle, he explained all this, before concluding, "It wouldn't be easy to get there, but I think once deep in the forest we would be hard to find."
"You're a hugger-mugger, ain't you?"
Latimer stood, or rather stooped, over their table. Pearce felt a flash of annoyance, and he knew the others shared it, for this was an unwelcome intrusion. But the sailor was smiling, and the words he used took the sting out of the mess table's resentment.
Mind if I sit with you, 'cause I can't stand any more of that Gerson cove. Had to come away.
Take a seat, said Pearce.
Where does that lad get off with his tale-telling?
Latimer asked, as he perched on the barrel that Little John had vacated.
Anyone would have him for a prince if they were to believe half what he says. Friend to this great man and that, and even closer to their wives, with a purse so bulging he would struggle to close it tight. Now I is for story-telling myself, and ain't too fussy about it being right true, as long as it satisfies in the article of amusement or interest. But that Gerson's tales are too tall to be borne.
Did he tell you how he came to be pressed? Asked Charlie.
He did not, though he insists it be an error that will be put right as soon as someone in authority gets to hear of it.
He was chucked off London Bridge.
Now you be telling tales.
Rufus nodded. You don't know that for certain, Charlie.
He did come from the bridge, Pearce added, and he was lucky to land by the boat because he can't swim. Charlie was quite indignant at his honesty being put in question, the usual defence of a practised deceiver. Who needs to be certain when a feller comes flying off the bridge without his shoes or coat in nothing but a shirt long enough to hide his shame? That's my part of the world, Rufus. Someone chucked him, and knowing as I do the nature of the bugger, it were no robbery. More'n likely it was someone he'd done settling a score. If he ever had a full purse, as he said, it was never come by honest. Surely it matters not where he came from or where he got his coin, Michael interjected. But he is not to be trusted, and that is a fact I have a mind to make plain.
Latimer nodded his deeply weather-beaten head.
Good to know that, mate. Not that I was inclined, but someone who knows the sort of saying, well, that's better. I'll pass the word if there's no objection, 'cause that silver tongue of his will take in some with wood in place of brains.
Tell the world, friend, Michael replied.
Sail ho!
They all lifted their heads at the sound, though not with much in the way of interest, for it was common enough to spot a ship in these waters. They heard the stripling, Midshipman Bailey, call out in a squeaky voice, Where away? As the reply came down from the tops, the canvas screen at the rear of the deck was flung open, and Lieutenant Colborne, still chewing, hurried towards the companionway ladder. Latimer snorted.
Can't even have his victuals in peace.
Well, there's no panic, surely? Asked Pearce, who well knew by now that any sail sighted must be 20 miles away. Latimer grinned as Colborne rushed past and up the ladder to the deck.
Believe me, mate, you would panic if you had to leave the deck to the likes of Bailey and Short, and to have come across such a pair of useless buggers.
Pearce was right about there being no need to panic, especially when the sail was identified as a British 74-gun warship. Back on deck, once she was close enough to make out her features with the naked eye, she was quickly identified by several of the crew who lined the side to watch her approach. Pearce was struck by the laxity with which Colborne allowed the men to put aside all thoughts of work so that they could observe this event. Again, it contrasted so much with Ralph Barclay's style of captaincy. The crew of HMS Brilliant, idly staring over the ship's side, would have sent him into a choleric rage. But there was another thing, a keen sense of anticipation in those eyeing the approaching warship, almost like a longing, which he put down to just being at sea, where the sight of another warship, especially a friendly one, was welcome.
"It's Billy Ruffian,"
called Sam, who had hauled himself up onto the bulwarks for a better view.
"My brother Brad and I sailed under his boys in the Spanish armament."
"Billy Ruffian?" asked Michael.
"Bellerophon," Latimer added, "if you call him proper."
"Slayer of the Chimera," Pearce said.
"What?"
"The Chimera."
"And what in the name of creation is a chimera?"
"A fire-breathing monster, part lion, part serpent, part goat."
"Sounds like the bugger snoring next to me last night."
"The story is told by Homer in the Iliad."
A reference to the great poetic saga of ancient Greece did nothing to remove the looks of ignorance from the faces nearby. But Pearce was aware that he had attracted attention. Several of the sailors close to him had turned to look. Bellerophon rejected the advances of Phaedra. "Who's he?" Sam demanded. She was the wife of Proetus, king of Argos, a beautiful woman, but no better than she should be, while Bellerophon was young, handsome, and brave.
"That's what we all need, mate," called Blubber. "A woman no better than she should be."
Sam was quick and got a laugh from the crew when he responded,
"Happen you get one, Blubber, if you weren't old, fat, ugly, and shy as hell in a fight."
"Don't call me old," Blubber replied with mock irritation. "Trouble was," Pearce continued, "Bellerophon rejected her advances, so she denounced him to her husband, who determined to kill him in revenge." Pearce had never actually seen a man shudder in the way Gerson did at those words. His whole frame shook from head to toe, and the blood drained from his face. He could not know that it had been a cuckolded husband, or more truthfully, some ruffians he had hired, who had chucked the man in the Thames with the full expectation that he would drown. He didn't linger to wonder at the reasons for Gerson's reaction, because it was clear that those watching the approaching ship with him wanted to hear the tale. On such a poky deck, with a steady but light breeze wafting Griffin along, it was impossible to speak in anything above a normal voice without being heard by nearly everyone, and he was aware that he had attracted lots of attention, including that of the two midshipmen. Colborne was studiously looking through his telescope, but could not hide the impression he was listening too. So he carried on with the story, telling how Bellerophon was sent off by King Proetus to his father-in-law, a neighbouring king, with a written message demanding his death. But the neighbour declined just to kill him outright, it being impious. So he was given impossible tasks designed to ensure his demise, all of which he carried out and survived. There was a lot more he could have said, for it was a good story, about Bellerophon's magic horse Pegasus, how he upset the gods and was driven mad, and challenged to explain what made him say what he did at the end. Pearce could have only replied that it was instinct. "Which just goes to prove that you can't trust kings and the like, because they might just be trying to get you killed for their pleasure as well as their purse. Dare say you've all met a captain or two of the same hue." A few heads nodded, most looked confused, and Colborne finally spoke, his voice even as if he had heard nothing untoward.
"Mr. Short, prepare the signal gun to fire a salute. The rest of you get about your duties. Mr. Bailey to the masthead and tell me if Bellerophon shows any sign of shortening sail."
An exchange of salutes followed as the 74-gun ship of the line bore down on them. Pearce had to admit she was a fine sight, with a full suit of pale brown sails set on 3 towering masts, her black hull carved through the sunlit sea, slightly heeled over by the wind, but making good speed.
"Any sign, Mr. Bailey?" called Colborne.
"None, sir. Looks as though she's going to sail right by." Colborne, who had obviously been anxious, seemed to visibly relax as he said to Short,
"Take the deck while I finish my breakfast."
"Aye, aye, sir." "He seemed a bit tight," said Pearce.
"Captain of that bugger has seen you by a mile. Could strip out half the company and take 'em on board, and there's not much Colborne could say to stop him. And it can't cheer him to know there's hardly a manjack aboard. We'll swap this smelly bugger for a 74, now that we know our chances of making a bit of coin are low. At least there's enough space aboard to sling your hammock for a proper night's rest. And I know come a blow which I'd rather be on."
As if to back up his words, and for no apparent reason, the ship's timbers emitted a loud crack. With the few seconds it took Latimer to say those words, Pearce evolved the notion of a secondary course of action. If this was not a happy ship, what would happen if it became even less so? The idea was a compound of many things. The attitude of the men to being on a cramped and seemingly unsafe vessel, which had so far been unsuccessful in the duty to which it had been sent. Colborne's tolerant style of command, allied to the uselessness of the two midshipmen. But paramount was his own need to do something rather than just wait for the opportunity to strike. Where it would lead he was unsure, but it was a fully formed notion by the time he had made his way below. Sailing a ship might be hard work for everyone aboard, but that still left time, provided the weather was not too foul, for yarning. Sailors, tale-tellers par excellence themselves, loved to listen to a story as well as relate one, which had Pearce searching his memory for tales to tell, be they fables, truths, or legends of the ancients that all had in common the themes of tyranny and betrayal. Having lived a couple of years in Paris, he was well versed in the crimes, real or imagined, of the late King Louis and his Bourbon ancestors. Being an entertaining storyteller made it easy to hold the attention of his shipmates, and he was surprised to find that he had learnt more of that skill from his father than he had realized. How and when to slightly raise his voice, the time to go deep and serious, as well as the need, regardless of the gravity of the tale, to make his listeners laugh, even if it was, as often as not, accompanied by a groan for a poorly executed pun. If proof were needed of the effectiveness of his method, it came from the rapt attention paid to him not only by strangers, but by his fellow pelicans. He alluded often to the slavery needed to build the pyramids, of pharaohs marrying or murdering their own siblings over the bones of countless slaves, somehow managing to make them the precursors of modern-day naval captains. From ancient Greece came the tales of heroes and capricious gods, and in the human sphere of good men such as Alcibiades, allowing fame and military success to go to their heads, until the Athenians threw a man aiming at tyranny out of the city, the moral being that even a seemingly good man could go bad. Robert the Bruce, even if he had been a king, was evoked from his native Scotland to show the virtue of patience in the face of seemingly insuperable odds, for he had triumphed over the greater despotism of Edward Ironside. Spartacus became a favourite, a story to be told more than once, for John Pearce relished the tale of the slave general who had taken on and beaten several Roman armies, a man with nothing making the mighty tremble. Even the fact that he lost in the end was put down to treachery rather than military weakness. But most compelling was the French Revolution, so recent that everyone aboard knew something of it, albeit that many of their recollections were skewed by falsehoods and exaggerations that had grown grotesque in passing through the triple loops of news journals, rumour and bias. Pearce knew more about that than most, having sometimes heard the truth from the lips of the very men who had carried out the overthrow of the monarchy, though he inclined it towards his own needs. His King Louis was not a weak, vacillating bankrupt, but a bloody oppressor. The twin estates of clergy and nobles were wholly, instead of only partly, corrupt, every lord and prelate determined to hang on to all their privileges and keep the poor and powerless in their place. Praise was heaped on the Parisian mob, a body Pearce detested, consisting as it did of opportunist rioters, goaded by rabble-rousers leading in seemingly permanent revolt the dregs of the French capital's slums. The Paris he described was a land of milk and honey, of hot chocolate laced with cream to be enjoyed at the caveau in the Rue Royale, instead of a place where the fear of denunciation had become prevalent, and anything like a luxury hard to come by. He spoke of the happy inhabitants of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine in glowing terms, of their honesty, friendliness, and political stability, which was the diametric opposite of the truth. They were uncouth, lazy opportunists, the main constituent part of the rioting mob which had stormed the Tuileries Palace and brutally murdered the 1,000-strong Swiss Guard. Added to that, since it was recent enough for everyone to know the story, he speculated, as every sailing man had done, about what had happened to Fletcher Christian and the crew of the Bounty, the mutiny itself a tale known by all, since Bligh's account had been published only 3 years previously. Being about sailors, the story had rapidly spread through the naval and merchant fleets. If he started by doubting their survival,
Pearce always ended by painting a picture of not only that, but of a life of plenty in all the areas sailors cared about: food, drink, and compliant women, never forgetting to add that in a France liberated from tyranny, and not too far off from the position in which they lay, all three of these commodities were freely available. Such stories, delivered quietly, could be just as effective as the best rabble-rousing speech of the kind for which his father was famous, especially when those listening were already dissatisfied, and not only inclined to listen but willing to be swayed. The cramped space between decks was an aid, creating a tight, dimly lit space where softly spoken words could be heard, and where an atmosphere of conspiracy was easy to fabricate. He imagined Colborne and the midshipmen, behind their screens, straining to hear his words, while wondering what effect they were having on the crew. It surprised even Pearce, the speed with which his line of thinking hit home. Before a week was out, he was sure of the effect he was having. It was helped by the steadily worsening weather. It did not take much on a ship like Griffin to make a life that was uncomfortable nearly intolerable, and as the height of the waves and the strength of the wind steadily increased, so did the sense of deprivation. It was not terrible, the kind of blow that threatened the very existence of the ship, but Griffin was a cork on a calm sea, a ship that could not meet a wave without letting all aboard know of its existence. As the sea state deteriorated, she pitched and yawed alarmingly. Her groaning seams opened with the strain, leaking enough water to require the hard physical work of regular and continuous pumping. This while the men were deprived of hot food, for the cook was not going to ignite his coppers on heaving planking, lest he set fire to the ship. Added to that, they saw nothing but ships they were forbidden to touch. Stop them they could, so that Colborne, following on from a wet and damned uncomfortable half-hour in an open boat, could examine their papers. Hold or take them they could not, and each hull let loose again was the object of resentment from rowers soaked to the skin, as well as subject to a calculation of what she would have been worth had she been a prize. Jocularity, the staple of getting through hard, toiling days, was replaced by endless moaning at whatever task the crew were asked to perform. The quiet acceptance which had existed when the Pelicans came aboard was replaced with sullen resentment, as Pearce acted on the existing natural grievances to make the whole seem like a plot by those in authority to do the men on HMS Griffin down, the execution of that conspiracy carried out by an uncaring Lieutenant Colborne. It was made easier by the very fact the crew had gripes aplenty that had nothing to do with the ship on which they sailed. They applied to the whole navy. Poor pay, slow to be delivered, that had stayed the same for over 100 years, since the time of the second King Charles. Food rotten in the casks served up as fresh, punishment seen as arbitrary, and an admiralty that was distant and uncaring. Every man aboard, being a volunteer and a previous member of the King's Navy, had a story of some hard-horse captain who flogged for fun, or of a scheming purser who had robbed them blind. Pearce was quick on that, with Colborne acting as his own purser, and he made sure the captain garnered to himself the opprobrium that always went with that office, till there was not a man aboard who trusted his scales, or wondered at the size of their grog ration or the weight of their tobacco. Tale-telling on its own, Pearce knew, would not be enough. Dissent was usually sullen and inactive. He needed to ratchet that up, to test the lieutenant's tolerance and force him into a reaction, to create a sense of unfair and arbitrary treatment on this ship that had existed on the last one. Colborne being no friend to the lash helped, for Pearce would have been wary of baiting a captain who would flog him for his misdemeanours, for that would have meant a permanent station at the grating. At worst, according to those he quizzed regarding punishment, he faced the stoppage of his grog, or extra time on the pumps, while at the extreme he could be gagged or stapled to the deck, though none of the crew had suffered such a fate up till now.
Yet the lieutenant seemed reluctant to even impose that sanction, despite the provocation. Being slow to obey an order was easy, even slower to acknowledge anyone's rank with a sir quite natural. But Pearce set himself to be a nuisance. Every time Colborne tried to make his way to the deck when Pearce was off duty, he found the man blocking his path, giving him a belligerent stare and taking time to move aside. If Pearce could collide with his commanding officer, or jostle another into his side, not impossible on such a small deck, he did so, and Colborne had to keep his wits about him when walking the deck to avoid the rope that might trip him, or a bucket of water thrown to windward that would come straight back inboard. The Pelicans became almost professionally cack-handed. In the case of Rufus Dommett it was natural, dropping things, failing to lash off the falls properly, spilling the lead-based blacking on the deck and trying to ensure that any collective act, like hauling on a rope, was messy instead of smooth. After any such task, Pearce would look aft, only to see that Colborne was paying him no attention whatsoever. It was frustrating the way the man failed to react, almost as if he knew what Pearce was about and refused to be drawn, and in truth what he was up against was petty rather than serious rebellion. The shot coming loose from its deck garland could be blamed on no one, yet it was odd that the only feet it threatened to damage as it rolled noisily over the planking were those of Colborne and his mids. Pearce felt his best game was the night, a pitch-black moonless one, when he sneaked one of the smaller cannonballs below with him, and having got his hammock rigged where he could get out of it on one side, he climbed the ladder, eased up the hatch cover, and let it go on the deck before dashing back to his cramped bed space. If he had been observed by the watch on duty, men who were dozing where they could, not a word was said, which was encouraging. This, he had been told, was the classic sign to the ship's officers of impending mutiny. With no moon or stars, and only a dim stern lantern to give those on watch any light, it took them time to find it as it rolled across the deck, sounding like thunder before it thudded into the bulwarks, a second before the ship pitched and sent it rumbling again. By the time it was recovered, every sailor below, off watch or on, a bunch who could slumber for the nation, was wide awake. As the days went by, he became more and more aware of Gerson. The man who had always been wary of him now seemed never to take his eyes off Pearce, watching him wherever he went, with that suspicious look that was so habitual, making him feel he was being sized up for a coffin. If he was on deck, so was Gerson, the same below. Indeed, he was not sure that he was unobserved when he went to the heads to relieve himself. The mutual animosity between them was palpable, and had existed almost from the first day he had had words with him. Gerson was selfish, unscrupulous, a coward who found betrayal natural, and he openly resented the natural leadership that Pearce exercised over the men he had been pressed with. "He's watching me like a cat looking at a meal, Michael." "A rat, more like, John boy. Sure, the devil has a hold on his heart, and he would do you harm if he could, but I cannot see what that would be." "It's uncomfortable." "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, is the whole ship not that, thanks to you?" Pearce responded with a grin. "And where will all this be taking us?" He could not answer, for he had no clear idea where his plan was leading. Did he want to provoke a mutiny? If he did and succeeded, what then? To sail to France was a nice idea for him, but he reckoned on that being a step too far for the rest of those aboard, for he had been told by more than one soft, concerned voice that the Navy always found men who had deserted to the enemy, and always hanged them. Had the Navy not sent a frigate all the way to the South Seas to hunt down the Bounty mutineers? Had not 3 of them, found on Otaheite, been hanged less than half a year past? The idea had occurred that he and the Pelicans might get off the ship some dark night, close to the French shore, in a stolen boat, with either active aid or total indifference of the rest of the crew. But even given the most benign set of circumstances, that was a very long shot indeed. What he would not admit was a known truth, that he could not abide to be passive. He had to do something, even if it did not, in the end, advance their cause one jot. "I intend to make our presence so troublesome to Colborne that he will be glad to see us off the ship." "Sounds to me like you just thought of that, brother, which I seem to recall is your way."
Michael was grinning as he said that, but it was one of those expressions designed to take the sting out of a truth. The Irishman was the only one aboard who knew the real nature of Pearce's predicament.
"I have got to do something, Michael. I cannot just wait."
O'Hagan laughed out loud. "Sure, I have seen that in you since the day we met, John boy, and I would only say this to you, that it is not always wise." "I don't know why you think I have wisdom, Michael. Charlie and Rufus are the same, and even that scrub Gerson. You all wait for me to decide on a course of action. I don't recall you waiting around to hear another opinion. In truth, I think that ordering folk about comes to you very naturally. Happen you should be wearing a blue coat instead of sailor's slops." "God forbid."
"So? What I want is for us to get off this ship, Michael, and not to be too vigorously pursued. That will suffice. But if I have to, it is us." The look the Irishman was giving Pearce now was serious and uncomfortable. Pearce did not want to lie, to admit that he had thought of how much easier things might be if he was alone, responsible only to himself and no other. But it was the prudent thing to do, even to a man he considered close. "My actions are for the good of us all, Michael."
"You there, you men!"
Midshipman Short glared at them to very little effect.
"Enough idling! Get on with your work!"
By now the pause before complying was natural, both men waiting till the midshipman swelled to yell at them before replying, "Aye, aye, sir." As the deck heaved again, Pearce wondered how they stayed afloat, and prayed that they would continue to do so as he struggled to keep a foothold on the continually flooded deck. At the same time he was hauling on the rope that would bring round the topsail yard, so that the ship would be brought onto the larboard tack, albeit with only a scrap of reefed canvas drawing. With the crash of the waves hitting the ship's timbers and a rain-filled wind that was deafening, thoughts were all he could sustain, for so all-consuming was the roar it placed him in near isolation to those within touching distance. Only a shout of the very loudest would convey words from one to another. The storm had come screaming in from the west at a speed that amazed the Pelicans, who had never seen it happen. One minute they were sailing with a near intolerable level of discomfort. The next the wind had increased ahead of a slew of black clouds, that accompanied by a sudden rush to shorten sail and secure anything loose on deck. The shore, a strip of white cliffs to the north, had disappeared as if some great hand had drawn a curtain over them, and within no time at all HMS Griffin was pitching and rolling in a mad dance. It was not uncomfortable now. It was hellish. Off the bows lay another labouring vessel, two-masted, of much the same size, one they had spotted and begun to close with before the weather worsened, under a similar scrap of canvas, the rare sight of which, as it rose, fell, and yawed, exactly replicating what was happening to the one beneath his bare and frozen feet. He had wondered what this tub would be like in a really heavy sea. Now he knew. It was awful. That Colborne could even contemplate a pursuit in such weather was amazing, all to close on a vessel that had failed to identify itself as friend, foe, or neutral, and Pearce was sure that, could the lieutenant come up with his intended quarry, he would want his guns run out to demand that she do so, or take the consequences. The man-ropes they had rigged were taut life-savers, something to keep a grip on as the deck canted and pitched, tipping the bowsprit into a wall of icy green water that turned white as it was smashed asunder by the prow, sending a mass of flecking foam into the faces of those manning the deck.
The tap on his shoulder from the sailor Little John, followed by the jabbing finger, was an admonition that he should get below, out of the wind and water, till the call came for another change of course. Pearce was about to follow when he saw the powder monkey go by on the opposite side, a boy practically crawling, one hand using the man-rope to make progress, the other clutched to his shirt to keep dry the cartridge he had stuffed inside. Looking to where he was heading, Pearce saw a gun crew struggling to lever round one of the forward cannons so that, when Griffin tacked once more, instead of pointing toward the empty sea, it would be aimed in the general direction of the chase. Curiosity overcame any discomfort. Not that there was much comfort to be gained on the lower deck amongst a crowd of dripping, shivering souls, the only benefit being a momentary release from the wind's howl which assaulted their ears, precious minutes before they would be called on deck again to once more change tack. How in the name of perdition could they even contemplate firing a cannon in such a sea, with so much spume, let alone the scud of the sea itself swirling around their feet? Arm hooked round the stay, eyes slitted to keep out the stinging salt water, Pearce watched as the men worked with their levers, jamming them under the trunnion wheels and pushing to gain an inch at a time, then holding hard as the deck pitched and threatened to undo their efforts. Colborne had also made his way past on the opposite side, not a blue-coated popinjay now, but swathed from head to toe in oilskins and foul-weather hat, head down and cantered forward, that being the only way he could make progress, and never once without a hand to secure himself. Pearce saw the nods and jerks of communication, even if the words were lost to him, saw the gun captain cradle the cannon touch-hole to protect the powder in the quill, ready for the charge that another rammed home down the barrel, the ball and wad following quickly to act as a barrier to the sea-water that would surely invade. His wonderment as to how they proposed to spark the flint was met by the knowledge that somehow someone had got a length of burning linstock to the gun. He did not hear the orders, but all his companions had been called on deck again. Michael was beside him to throw him a bewildered glance, and Little John was slapping each of them to take their place on the rope they had so recently secured. Now they would need to hold it steady once it was released, paying it out, working in tandem with those on the other side of the deck as they hauled, so that it came round steadily, with enough restraint to ensure it was not blown uselessly away. There were no games to play now. Things had to be done right, or they would be in serious danger. Leaning backwards as the rope slid round the cleat, Pearce saw the gun port opened, watched as the gun crew used the forward pitch of the deck to run the cannon out, tried to follow the track, which was surely coming close to aim, as Colborne, arm raised and bent over, looked down the barrel, seeking the point at which it would bear. Something was whipped off the touch-hole, perhaps a piece of oiled and waterproof canvas. The quill full of dry powder jammed into the slot as the lieutenant's arms dropped and he jumped sideways. The slow match had to be cupped to keep it dry, the man applying it relying on the mates who had hold of his clothing to keep him on his feet as he carried out his task. As soon as he touched, he too jumped back out of the way. The crash and subsequent loud bang were enough to overcome the howling wind, that followed by a cloud of black and acrid smoke that swept back along the deck. Pearce strained on tiptoe to see where the ball, now just visible in the air, would land, only to be disappointed when it merely disappeared into a mass of water so disturbed as to kill off any chance of a spout. It had no effect on the quarry, except one. Pearce heard the faintest of booms, and saw black smoke envelop the stern of the chase. He assumed they too had fired off a cannon. But they got a result, as carried on the wind the ball sent a spout of water up into the air well off the larboard bow. Also, from being an unknown quantity, it suddenly became something else, as a flag flew to the masthead. It was not one he recognized, certainly not a tricolour, but the gesticulations from those around the cannon left him in no doubt that it was not a neutral. The gun was run in and reloaded, though in a fashion far from swift or smooth. In fact, it was as if the crew and the officer directing the affair were intoxicated, so much did they stagger around, continually seeking handholds in between the duties they had to carry out to fire the ordnance. Pearce knew what they were doing was extremely dangerous. A 9-pounder cannon and its trunnion, which must weigh well over a ton, was enough to crush any flesh and bone with which it came into contact. The only thing that was stopping that from happening was swift jabs with the levers that had about them an air of desperate reaction, as the sea state played upon the ship, the rise and fall far from regular, that made worse by some kind of cross-sea, forcing the bows to yaw, this while on the quarter-deck 6 men fought the ship's wheel to keep the rudder where it was required. The curtain of rain lifted just as the cannon fired its second ball, and a break above showed some white in the clouds, increasing the light and rendering much more clear the scene before them, though it was not enough to show where the shot landed. The ship they were chasing was much the same size, now identified by a Latimer shout as a "Gravelines, bugger," which was rendered as more of an insult than a description. Given that it had aloft only enough canvas to bring the thing steerage way, there was no way to tell much else about it, except that she was struggling more than Griffin to deal with the conditions, tacking in the same fashion into the wind. The gain Colborne was making was imperceptible, but gain it was. This time Pearce went below with the others, to find Latimer was crowing about being right, this while he, like everyone else, was shaking himself to get some of the sea-water off his body. So much had come down the hatch on them, or with them, that Pearce was standing inch-deep in slushing water, which would work its way down to the bilges from where it would have to be pumped out.
"Spotted the sod right off. Knew its lines like the back of my hand. A Bylander, which ain't no surprise, given the bastards are half Dutch."
"You been in and out of Gravelines a few times, then, Latimer?" asked Blonde Sam.
"Happen," Latimer replied, suddenly more guarded.
Blubber called out next, "Come on, lads, open up and tell for how much you've done Billy Pitt." That set a few voices going, with comments that Latimer was a rich bugger in secret, and that he had a coach and four and only came to sea with the Navy for the fresh air.
"What are they about?" asked Michael, looking at John Pearce. He could only shrug.
Where the ship was from, or its type, meant nothing to him, apart from the vague recollection that the port of Gravelines was in Flanders, and had been one of the places he and his father might have gone when they fled England. In fact, he was ruminating on the very obvious fact that, even soaking wet and freezing cold, heaving about in these cramped surroundings, all it took to alter the mood of these men was a slim prospect of a prize and a bit of money. The men fighting the wheel and rudder were probably the same, and that led him to the conclusion that he was probably wasting his time in his efforts to undermine Colborne's authority. It was Little John who answered Michael's question.
"Gravelines is the port the East Coast smugglers make for to pick up their goods. The town lives off such trade, and its castle pennant is known to all."
He then called to Latimer.
"Reckon she's stuffed with brandy and lace, do you?" "Not this far down channel, mate, when there's a crossing to the Kent coast that can be done in a night, even on a headwind. No, she'll be armed and prize-hunting, and if she's new out, she'll be crammed to the gunwales. So let's hope she's not fresh, for if she is, we'll have a right fight on our hands."
If that was intended as a warning of possible tough times ahead, it had no effect.
"Mind," Latimer added, "if she can stay out of range until nightfall, which will come early given the cloud, she might just get clear." "Then it'd be best we crack on and bring her to," called Blubber.
"God forbid with this wind," said Little John quietly.
The hatch above Pearce's head was lifted, and Midshipman Bailey's voice rang out,
"All hands to make sail!"
That was followed by another stream of cold green water.
"Christ almighty, make sail!" crowed Blubber, as jolly as ever. "Old Coldbarge must have heard me."
There was an eagerness to the way the crew ascended the companion ladder that had been lacking this last week.
Clearly nothing that anyone said would puncture their love of a fight. Colborne was back on the quarterdeck, speaking trumpet in hand, to direct things as the Pelicans found themselves, soaked once more, hauling on the falls to bring round and hold the upper yard so that the topmen could get onto it from the shrouds, this while the rudder was eased to allow the ship to fall off onto the wind. If the weather had changed, apart from the lack of teeming rain, Pearce could not detect it. The wind seemed as strong as it had been previously, so loud through the rigging that it was a permanent, near-deafening whistle. The topmen went aloft with all the assurance on which they prided themselves, acting as if the ship was on a mill-pond, making John Pearce grateful for his lowly landsman rating. Even running before the wind, Griffin was heaving fore and aft, and what he felt on deck would, he knew, be exaggerated 10 times aloft. Spreading out along the yard, the topmen leant over and quickly, on command, they undid a set of knots to let a reef out of the topsail, that followed by a command to those on the falls to sheet it home. The effect of that was immediate, as the bows, pressed so much harder, went right under the first wave they met, washing aft 2 of the gun crew who had been left at their post, leaving the rest hanging on for dear life. One was brought up by a second cannon, the contact so painful that his scream could be heard clearly above the noise of wind and rigging. The second had good luck, missing that same obstacle by a whisker and being washed towards the open hatch from which the crew had just emerged. A desperate hand got hold of the edge and brought him to, while others grabbed for his hurt companion to hold him from pitching toward the bows as they dropped into a trough. "Topmen down!" Colborne yelled. As soon as that order was obeyed, with those sailors still on the shrouds, he ordered the yard braced round and the helm ported so that they could come back into the wake of the chase. Not that anyone could see a wake. In fact, as soon as they hit the base of the trough, all they could see was a wall of water, into which disappeared the bowsprit, followed once more by the bows, deeper than they had been hitherto. "Saints in heaven!" Michael screamed. "The bastard wants to drown us!" Pearce heard his friend, but his eyes were on the faces of those men who knew more about seafaring than he, and the look of doubt they were displaying did nothing to reassure him. Charlie Taverner had his eyes closed and was praying silently. Young Rufus had his wide open, and he looked as if he had just seen the grim reaper. Slowly the ship began to heave over, the deck beneath their feet falling alarmingly and the other bulwark rising. Pearce was sure he could see the unused cannons straining to break free from their lashings. Unmistakable was the plight of the men who had got hold of the injured member of the bow-chaser gun crew, hanging on to him with one hand while the other sought to keep them on their side of the ship. Down they dropped, Pearce feeling his stomach rise and his foothold begin to give, so quick was the motion. The mast seemed to be right above Pearce's head, and with the men still on the shrouds laying near flat, it seemed as if it would never stop, that the ship was going to be driven under by the force of the wind on the sail, and for all the danger he was in, Pearce felt the bile rise in his throat. They were going to die because Colborne wanted to take a prize. The thought stayed with him as the deck ceased to fall and slowly began to right itself, and Pearce heard, with relief flooding through his being, Colborne give the orders to ease the falls, for the topmen to get back on the yard and clew up the offending sail. It was a long chase, and an uncomfortable one, of tack upon tack, soaking upon soaking, with precious little time to go from that to being merely very wet in the meantime. There was no chance of food, though Colborne did manage to get distributed an extra tot of rum. The effect of that on men with empty stomachs was a higher level of inebriation, and that in turn led to an increase in bellicosity that threatened to come to a head below decks, and might have done if they had not been called back up, this time to remain so, for the chase was in plain view now and slowly but surely coming within range. The starboard bow-chaser, the one most likely to stay clear of the scudding water, was firing regularly now, though Pearce thought it more in hope than expectation, for he had no notion of how anyone, however skilled they professed to be, could take aim from such a moving platform,
while the Gravelines bugger wisely was not even trying to retaliate. Just as he was sure Colborne, who was doing that aiming, was wasting his time, a shot struck home, slicing through the crown of the nearest bulwark and the rigging lashed to it. The topsail yard of the chase swung abruptly, the falls holding it cut through, and Pearce could see it swing abruptly and uselessly. The crew would be running to get it under control as those on the rudder paid off to keep the ship before the run of the sea. Not safe, but safer. The damage done by Colborne's lucky shot, and the time taken to make it good, brought the enemy to within hailing distance. But that was the point at which they restored way on the ship and tried to haul off again. Once more Griffin was in her wake, this time close enough to make the chance of another lucky shot really tell. One removed a bit of the stern, though at a deflecting angle that saw most of the power, along with a goodly bit of the taffrail, go into the sea. Elevating his cannon, Colborne tried for the rigging, and though one shot went clean through the topsail, it seemed to have little effect on the chase. Another hour passed, on deck, off deck, and on again, tacking every time to gain the precious inches to overhaul the chase. This while darkness began to encroach, for though the clouds had lifted somewhat, it was still an overcast day. Now the talk below was less excited, it being more about the possibility of a missed chance. That made telling by the way the effect of that tot of rum wore off. Again they were called on deck, and the crew ascended the companion ladder with much less enthusiasm. They were tallied off to release the main-deck cannon, including the carronades, which were eased round so that their muzzles pointed out through the now open gun ports, an act which increased the amount of sea-water that swilled across the deck. Midshipman Short took station behind the battery to control the fire, as the gun captains started to fit their flintlocks, each covering them to keep them dry, this before powder monkeys appeared with their leather cartridges, and the process of loading began. Slow, because the ship was still heaving back and forth, with a good yaw in between as she began to crest a crossing wave. Touch-holes were cleaned, so that the quills which would set off the charge could be easily inserted. The cartridge of powder rammed home, followed by ball and wad, and as it was completed, each gun captain, with a raised arm, pronounced themselves ready. Was Colborne, who stood looking straight ahead, staying silent to heighten the tension? Pearce was sure there was a moment of theatricality in the way he waited, while everyone on the deck, still obliged to keep hold of something to maintain their feet, looked aft. Then the trumpet slowly went to his lips. Even with this he had to bellow to make himself heard.
"We are going to bring this fellow to, lads, who seeks to avoid us, and is even declining to fight. And we are going to do it in the next half a glass, for if we don't it will be dark and he might elude us. So when I give the order, it is to fire as your guns bear. I'm going to fall off to larboard and swing us round. The oncoming wave will raise us, and I want you to fire on the crest. The sea state and the wind obliges me to come right round, so once your guns are housed, I want you back on the falls to bring the ship into the wake of the chase again. Once we have closed again, I will repeat the manoeuvre until we get him somewhere vital. Carronades, I want you firing at maximum elevation, for if one of you can hit him once, he will be done for regardless of where it strikes."
If it was meant to be rousing, it failed to do the trick. If anything, the men looked disgruntled, while once again it was garrulous Latimer who, mouth pressed to Pearce's ear, supplied the reason. "A carronade ball hits that barky foursquare, and there'll be naught left to take."
"Stand by!"
Colborne yelled.
"Let fly!"
It was as if he had given an order to the enemy as well, who could no doubt see what was taking place on the British deck, for the chase bore up as suddenly as Colborne did in a copycat manoeuvre, the side of his ship erupting with cannon fire a split second before Griffin's foremost gunner got off the first shot. Most of the enemy shot whistled through the rigging, doing little damage, cutting the odd line before sending up spouts of water off the stern. The other effect was twofold: to close the gap between the ships,
and to present the rest of the Griffin gunners a much juicier target.
"Daft bugger!"
Latimer shouted.
"He ain't daft,"
added Little John, his voice high in pitch.
"He just don't know what's coming. He thinks our guns be the same as his own."
The two carronades bore on the target and fired together. There was no time or distance to watch the flight this time. They carried it in seconds. Only one of the rounds hit home, but that was enough, for the side of the enemy ship below the quarterdeck just disintegrated as the heavy ball smashed through the scantlings, and when the smoke and debris cleared, there was no one left to hold a wheel, and no wheel to hold. The rest of the shot from the 5 forward cannon did little damage, bar one which glanced off the mainmast, gouging out a deep piece of wood.
"Reload!"
Colborne shouted, giving an order that was unnecessary, for the gunners had anticipated the command. HMS Griffin swung round onto the wind, taken halfway and near broached by a wave. Somehow Colborne, or the men on the rudder, got the head round to fall off on the wind, and by the time they had way on the ship once more, the gunner captains had raised their arm to tell the commander they were ready to fire. More orders followed to bring the ship round into the wind again, to face an enemy that was wallowing and in some distress.
"Stand by to give her another drubbing, lads."
"What is he about?" demanded Latimer. "She'll strike without another shot being fired."
If Latimer was trying to advise his captain, he was not listening. Again he ordered the sheets eased, and again they came round broadside on to their quarry.
"Fire!"
The side disappeared in a second cloud of smoke, blown away as swiftly as the first. This time more shots struck home, 3 of the forward cannon and both of the carronades. The destruction was appalling. It seemed as though half the side of the enemy ship had been blown away. The deck was clear of people, there was no one steering, and the way she was heaving to and fro, it looked as though she might just roll over and go under.
"Sheet home! Helmsman, bring me alongside. Master-at-arms, get the cutlasses and clubs issued, and stand by to board. I want her lashed tight to us to keep her afloat. Mr. Short, as soon as that is achieved, bring us round before the wind for safety."
"Board!"
spat Latimer, close enough to Pearce's ear to be heard, as he saw Colborne's steward hand him his cutlass and his hat.
"There's bugger all left aboard and precious little left afloat."
By the time Griffin came alongside, the carnage was obvious, for the deck had been just as heavily manned as her opponent. Probably the whole crew had been employed, and as a consequence they had all suffered. Ropes snaked out to lash both ships together, and they jumped across to a deck where there was no one left to fight them. Those not wounded or killed by cannon fire had been downed by splinters or crushed under guns that had broken loose, while the rest, who had survived unscathed, had fled below. Where the wheel had been, there was just a mass of bodies and splintered wood. Given that was the point from which the ship would be commanded, it seemed certain that there was no one to surrender her, so Colborne stepped towards the mainmast, weak and creaking because of the shot that had gouged it, and swung his hanger to cut the halyard and bring down the Gravelines flag.
"Mr. Bailey, a party below to secure any prisoners. Give me a report on the state of the hull, see if she's making any water."
A stream of orders followed, to house the loose cannon and gather the shot that was rolling all over the deck, to see to those wounded and get them below. Others were set to rigging repairs, and Colborne ordered that the Griffin's carpenter be sent for to assess the damage, the whole carried out by a naval lieutenant who was obviously high on excitement. Bailey came back on deck to report that there was a break in the scantlings through which she was making water, but not so serious that pumping would not hold it.
"Good," Colborne replied. "I want her made sound enough to be taken under tow, and then we can work to render her seaworthy again."
"Are we taking her into port, sir?"
Colborne's eyes flashed. "Yes, Mr. Bailey, we are. And I dare say I shall be invited by the Commodore to partake of a glass of his best brandy when he sees we have a prize."
Not everyone aboard the prize had been killed, though few seemed entirely whole, and given the massive repairs to be carried out, shocked as they were, they had to be pressed into service, and Pearce found himself working alongside them.
The quality of the French he spoke surprised them more than the questions he asked, not that they were able to tell him about anything that was going on in Paris. He continued to speak to them long after he realized the futility of asking them anything about the present state of their country, until he realized that, occupied as he was, he had not seen Colborne get close enough to hear him talk. Loudly he reverted to English, unsure whether his previous conversations had been overheard.
"It's not a dead loss, mates. There'll be gun money and head money to share, but that ain't no comparison to a ship whole."
Blubber was talking to the pelicans, but there were enough close nearby to hear and murmur assent, with the general opinion being that while Colebarge might expect to lord it in the Port Commodore's chamber and sup claret by the pint, they and he had been dunned out of a goodly sum because the prize was so damaged that it would fetch little when sold. Latimer was especially scathing.
"Smashed quarter-deck, with the cabin below like matchwood, bulwarks caved in, a bloody great dent below water, and a mainmast that the carpenter says will need to be taken out and a new one put in. The prize master might buy her in to sell as a coastal trader, but you can bet if he does, it'll be for a song."
"Happen the Commodore won't be happy to see his eighth so blasted."
"He won't know no different, mate. All he'll have to go by is the report he reads, and that will flatter Colebarge no end, lest someone tell him otherwise. His dispatch will tell of a desperate battle where only luck and better guns saved him from like damage."
"It's not fair he gets more than we do," whined Gerson. "An eighth share, and he wasn't even there."
For once Pearce backed Gerson up, which got him an odd look.
"There will be plenty of lords and the like dipping into your money if they get the chance."
"That's the way it is,"
said Latimer, though with a look that told John Pearce he was as unhappy about it as Gerson. The collective growl that followed showed that the old mariner was not alone.
"Flag officers get their eighth, captains get 2, lieutenants, warrants, petty officers and mids get 2, and we gets the rest."
"Hope the price of a whore ain't risen while we've been out, then," Blubber moaned.
"You've never spent more'n 2pence in your life, mate," said Latimer.
"Well, that's 'cause I ain't never met a woman in my life worth more than the price of a good meat pie."
Matt had his say.
"God help you, Blubber, if we ever do take a decent prize, you'll explode yourself in a week."
"Can you imagine the coach and 4 he'd need?" added Sam. "There's not a spring made to hold him."
Blubber's face took on a look of virtue.
"Once I's rich, it'll be bread, water, and the odd bit of leaf green for me."
"You starve yourself," Latimer scoffed. "That I'd like to see."
Pearce cut in on an opportunity too good to miss. "Did I ever tell you the tale of the time there was no bread in Paris? It was in a state of near riot, and the Queen, when someone told her, said, 'Can they not eat cake?'
I bet she had as much cake as she could scoff."
"She had bread, mate," Pearce insisted,
"and meat, fowl, and fish, with pies by the cartload, as much as she wanted, and so did the king and those who served him. It was the ones with nothing who had nothing."
"Tell us that Spartacus tale again, Pearce," asked Matt. "I likes that one, and we got time before we sight land."
"Captain wants to see you, Pearce."
The demand was so unusual that it killed off the normal banter that would have attended a fellow sailor thought to be in trouble, and at this very moment it was the last place Pearce wanted to be. He wanted to be on deck, to examine the approaching shore and harbour, looking out for opportunity. He had denied himself that to avoid engendering suspicion, for there was not a man-jack aboard would not be rendered curious by a sailor choosing, on a cold and windy night in late March, to be on deck when off duty, rather than snug below. Was he in trouble? It did not seem so. The summons to attend upon the captain was not delivered by anything approaching sourness. Indeed, Colborne's steward, a stony-faced bugger called Teal, had looked as curious as the rest, meaning that he himself had no idea what it portended. There was some satisfaction to get beyond that double canvas screen, one that Pearce had glared at so often, to actually see for himself how an officer in command of such a vessel lived.
The gunner occupied half the small space between them on one side, in a cubicle crammed with everything he needed to see to his tasks. At the rear was the hatch to the powder room, set in the even more cramped hold, a special heavy screen fitted with a pane of glass stitched in so that the gunner could see to load his cartridges by the same lantern that illuminated his work and sleep space, the flame safely kept apart from where powder might ignite. On the other side, behind the steward's pantry, lay the berths of midshipmen Short and Bailey, which, given its dimensions, had Pearce guessing that the poor buggers had to sleep near upright. That there was a marine in between, sentry to the inner sanctum, was risible, as if one such fellow could stop a crew determined to get at the man who lived beyond. The sentry cocked an eyebrow, to impart the fact that the summons to him as well was a mystery, before he called out Pearce's name and pulled back the flap to admit him. Colborne was seated at a tiny desk covered in papers, as far forward as he could manage, this to avoid the sweep of the rudder arm, which would traverse the entire cabin and brain him if he was standing. Another canvas screen ran fore and aft on the starboard side, creating a sort of triangular lean-to, which Pearce surmised hid the cot on which the lieutenant slept. 3 lanterns guttered away in what was a place of no natural light or air, so that, concentrated as it was by the cramped surrounding, it seemed even more malodorous than the berth occupied by the crew. At least some of the stink they created escaped up through the hatch. Pearce had to put a hand out as the much-damaged prize, being towed, jibbed, stretching the cable that joined the 2 vessels and checking Griffin's progress.
"Sit down, Pearce, on that barrel under the lantern."
Colborne continued to scribble away, the quills scratching across paper, thus allowing Pearce to take a really good look at his quarters. No space was wasted. Even the gaps between the deck beams were used to house his sword and a dagger, hats, a pair of telescopes, a sextant, and all sorts of odds and sods that could be secured by a couple of well-placed hooks. The racks holding the ship's muskets and boarding pistols were behind Colborne, chained off, as if his own body was defence against unauthorized distribution. His desk, dented and scratched varnish, was of the kind that would break into 3 parts, and no doubt there was a space allocated to it should action demand removal. If Colborne was sat on a chair, it was one without a back. More likely it was a cushioned barrel like the one on which Pearce was propped, that or the lieutenant's sea-chest. Having finished his examination, and having decided that there was precious little advantage, barring privacy, to be had from commanding such a tub like HMS Griffin, he was left to look at the top of Colborne's head.
"We will be anchored within the hour,"
the lieutenant said, as he sanded the last of his writing. The ropes controlling the rudder creaked slightly as the man on the wheel made some minor adjustment to the course, probably to accommodate the tow. Pearce did not bother to reply. The heavy book Colborne had been using was lifted and the sand blown with some care onto the bare desktop beneath. Colborne, having put the book in his desk, took the top off his sanding pot and with one hand gathered that which he had spilled into a pile, then eased it to the edge and inside. If he had wanted to hint at straitened circumstances, he could not have done better. The man was so poor he could not bear to waste a bit of fine sand. Colborne finally looked at him, elbows on his desk, leaning forward, a direct stare, almost challenging.
"I dare say your mind is full of plans to desert."
Pearce replied with an arch look. His eyes ranged around the cramped space. "Would I not be a fool to seek to abscond from such plenty?" The smile with which Colborne responded, wry with a trace of bitterness, made acknowledgment of the irony unnecessary.
"You are an educated man, Pearce, are you not?"
"Educated enough to know on which side my bread is buttered." The pause before he added a "sir" was just long enough to let this man know how much it meant. Colborne sat back so that his whole face was in light. He looked weary, hardly surprising given the tasks he had to perform, which allowed for little in the way of uninterrupted sleep.
You have every right to be cautious, Pearce, but I am not here to probe.
It is I who am here, and wondering why. Colborne sighed.
There are few advantages to be had from commanding a ship like Griffin.
There was an insistent thought in Pearce's mind telling him to let the man speak, to say nothing, because even the most innocuous words could be revealing. Insistent it might be, but his anger overrode it.
There are more than there are for a common seaman. Common seaman? You may be many things, but assuredly you are no common seaman.
Colborne looked him in the eye as if inviting him to confirm that statement with some supporting fact. When it did not come, he added,
If anything, you are a supremely uncommon one.
Pearce responded with the faintest nod, for there was little sense in denying something so obvious.
Your mode of speech marks you out as something of a gentleman, which I recall I noticed from our first encounter. You can read, and I even heard you speak French to some of the men we captured in that privateer. Good French, easy French, the kind that tells me you are comfortable in the language. My own knowledge of that is too limited to be sure of what you inquired, but I did hear the word Paris mentioned more than once.
Given the fact that we are at war with the Revolution, and the seat of that government is in Paris, what else would I ask them?
I doubt that any bunch of sailors from the Flanders shore could tell you much.
The silent stare was enough to impart to Colborne that anything that had been said was his to hold.
I'm glad that you don't deny your skill in the language.
Why? Colborne's tone changed. The weariness was gone. It was now quite pointed.
It would disappoint me to have you tell me a lie.
Getting no response, he added,
My saying that does not make you curious?
I cannot help feeling, Lieutenant Colborne, that I am not the one in this cabin who is curious.
Touché.
Colborne's brow furrowed, which told Pearce that the sparring was over, that the man was about to come to the nub of why he had called him in here.
You know, Pearce, when you and your companions came aboard, this was an ordinary ship. I would not say a happy and contented vessel, it has too many faults for that, but no more fractious than most on such a duty. There were grumbles, there always are, and there is little point in my rehashing them, for you know well what they consisted of. Then there is the added burden associated with a ship's captain acting as his own purser, which always doubles the opprobrium in which that particular breed of individual is held.
Every man aboard is convinced you are raking in a neat profit from the office.
Oh, yes, said Colborne in a bitter tone. Believe me, it is not a duty that I sought. It is one forced on me by the size of the ship. And as for profit, I am making so much I cannot spare a bit of sand to dry my ink. I sometimes think I would still be held in low esteem if I gave them their baccy and replaced their clothing for nothing.
Why is he being so revealing? That thought was mingled with a strange twinge of sympathy, for in his face, manner, and words, Colborne was letting show the loneliness allied to the crushing responsibility that came with command. Limited knowledge of the Navy did not extend to ignorance of the price such an institution extracted for failure. The articles of war that Colborne had read out to them when they had been forced aboard applied equally to him, plus a whole load of expectations not placed upon those for whom he was responsible. He had to be diligent, brave, and clever, none of which would guarantee success. That took luck as well, which was probably why he cared nothing for the damage he had inflicted on the prize they were towing in. Success was more important to his chances of advancement than money. He could not be very well connected, or he would not be here. People with powerful patrons did not end up in command of an armed cutter. It was a revelatory thought that, if anything, Colborne had a greater desire to get off this ship than he had himself. The man craved promotion, while being well aware that such an outcome could only come from some action in which he must risk everything. Pearce had a momentary temptation to admit that he understood both those burdens and the anxieties of running a naval ship of war, to allude to the increase his campaign to undermine discipline had engendered. The moment passed, for he could not let natural empathy interfere with his aims.
"Which," Colborne continued after a lengthy pause, "is what you have been intimating I should do. How easy it is to convince a man deprived of much that someone with a little has an abundance. I have done nothing that falls outside the laws under which we both labour." "You have, I think, but not in my sight or that of anyone who would report you to me. No, the real damage has been done by your tongue. Thanks to you and your tales of the ancients, of tyrannical kings and capricious gods, I now have a crew that goes about its duties with a scowl, that deliberately talks every time I or my subordinates open our mouths to issue a command, that a few weeks ago went about those same duties with—" Colborne waved his hand, searching for the word. "Ignorance," said Pearce, suddenly aware of the smell of coffee. It was time for the captain's once-a-day luxury, his ritual. He had caught the smell before and been envious. "I wonder, does making a man wiser make him any more content?" Since Pearce declined to respond, Colborne carried on. "Was it you who let loose the round-shot the other night, or was it one of your pelicans?" It was the word pelican that surprised Pearce, and much as he tried to disguise that, it must have shown somewhere in his reaction. "I know all about your little coterie. Telling tales is not an activity on which you hold a monopoly. I know where and how you were first taken up." Gerson, thought Pearce, fighting to keep the certainty of that thought out of his expression. The slimy, ungrateful toad would sell his mother down the river for an extra tot of rum. No, that was not true. Gerson would do it for nothing. "I have thought long and hard about you, Pearce, how to deal with you, for I must do something if I am not to be brought to naught. You have done everything you can inside the Articles of War to try to raise the ire of the ship's crew. It is not too much to say that I suspect you are intent on fomenting mutiny. If that happened, my career in the Navy could be in ruins, and I doubt the 2 midshipmen who depend on me would fare much better." The canvas screen between them was pulled back, and Teal poked his head through, that followed by a tray bearing a coffee-pot and 2 cups. 2 cups? The tray was placed on the deck, Colborne nodded his thanks, and the steward disappeared, leaving Pearce with the thought that there, very likely, was another well-tapped source of information for the captain. Gerson was not the only one, but at least the steward could not be accused of betrayal. He owed the Pelicans and John Pearce nothing. Gerson owed them his neck. "I take it you like coffee?" The advent of that pot and those 2 cups had thrown Pearce, and he was uncomfortable with the knowledge. What was Colborne about? He should not be here, in the cabin, chatting away. The whole notion of his plan did not include such a scenario. Him at a grating, as an extreme possibility, yes. Taking the lash, perhaps. More like gagged with a piece of wood tied to his mouth, creating the kind of grievances that would, he hoped, tear apart what little loyalty the crew retained for Colborne, king and country. And he felt weakened by the certainty this man now pouring him coffee was showing. It was like the boot was on the other foot, with the ship's captain knowing exactly what he was about, and John Pearce being in total ignorance. Colborne sighed and looked around the cramped space. "How did I end up here?" He passed over a cup and saucer, 2 fine china objects which in this setting were exceedingly incongruous. Pearce accepted, more to cover his perplexity than anything else. The first sip seemed to clear his mind, and he suddenly knew that Colborne was trying to seduce him with kindness, to deflect him from his actions by creating an intimacy. "I am supposed to be grateful for employment when so many of my fellow lieutenants are on the beach. And I am grateful, you know, for that would be worse." Pearce could see what was coming. The sort of confessional chat that would seek to suck him in, to show that Colborne was not so very different from those he commanded, that he too was at the mercy of forces over which he had no control. Let him proceed. The coffee was pleasant, if not spectacularly tasteful, an inexpensive blend that went with the lieutenant's impecuniosity, but neither it nor the coming tale would deflect Pearce from his goal. And yet, sometimes, when I sit here, or curl up in yonder cot, I wonder if I have not deeply offended someone, a senior officer or some politician who has the ear of the Admiralty. It could even be a malicious clerk, someone in the bowels of the building who spends his days poring over the logs and muster books, and yet still has to deal with importuning letters from unemployed sailors. Did I badger them too much? Is there something in my past of which I am unaware? I worry, Pearce, that I will be stuck in this ship, condemned to plough my way up and down the English Channel until doomsday. Forgotten by all in authority, fetching in the odd, not very valuable prize, patted on the head and sent back to sea again, while men who serve aboard flagships or with powerful patrons proceed effortlessly past me to their post-captaincy without having ever seen an ounce of action.
Pearce was subjected to a look, one that sought some notion of the effect of these revelations.
I detect no sympathy in your demeanour, nor should I expect any. It is a cruel world we inhabit, and that to which I am being subjected is a minor scourge compared to the lot of most of my fellow men. But you can see my case, can you not? I need promotion, but how can I achieve that?
Pearce could not resist it, being presented with such an opening.
Getting half your crew killed should do the trick.
Colborne actually grinned, something Pearce had never seen before, and it took years off him, making him look boyish.
If I do that, I stand a very good chance of getting myself killed, or even worse, so badly wounded as to render further service impossible.
The notion would not stop you. The grin had gone, to be replaced with that look of determination that was more familiar.
No, it would not. But I would not take this ship into action on the grounds of personal gain, and I hope you believe that.
I think it is more important that you believe it.
But to return to you, the one thing that would sink me without hope of salvation would be a mutiny. And that is what you are intent on causing.
A hand came up to stop Pearce responding, an unnecessary one, since he had no intention of admitting what was tantamount to guilt.
I know of many captains who would have had you gagged to silence your tongue, some who would even have you seized up to the grating a long time ago, and who would have flogged you daily if necessary to stop your seditious tale-telling. They would have made your life a misery and enjoyed the experience. Me, I fear I am too weak a soul for such methods. I know I should employ them, but I shrink from the actuality. In short, in the article of commanding one of His Majesty's ships, I am irresolute.
Intended to make Pearce feel like a scrub, it was partly successful, for he found it hard to completely dislike this man. He was half inclined to tell him so, to let on just how often he had thought that what he was doing was unfair. But it was enough for one person in this place to be confessional.
Yet I must do something about you, Pearce, for the reasons I have outlined. I do not think I am an unpopular commander, and I know that you have not portrayed me as such. I know that you have taken the Navy, the government, and a cruel world as the hooks on which to foster discontent. Odd that you have a power to command men that I actually envy. Not everyone, of course, but you have so suborned a substantial portion of my crew that they look to you before they look to the natural authority that I represent.
So, what to do? Let me and my companions off the ship.
Which you are well aware I cannot contemplate.
Leave?
We will not be in harbour long enough to justify the granting of it, and what would be said when I complained of being short-handed if I was known to be giving men leave of absence?
We are willing to desert.
Complicity in such as that, if it were ever exposed, would harm me more than a mutiny. And what makes you think you would not be caught? The port we are about to enter, as well as the forest behind it, is teeming with rogues who make part of their living from selling deserters back to the Navy. You may think you can outwit them, but look at you, in your sailor's ducks.
I have a change of clothes.
You do, but that will not suffice. What about your hands, Pearce? Look at the tar that has become ingrained in your flesh from hauling on ropes. Try telling some gang of crimps that you are not a sailor. They will nod, Pearce, then they will laugh, and then they will bind you tight and frog-march you to the nearest officer of the press and collect their bounty. I am tempted to ask, Colborne continued, what you intended to do once you had caused your mutiny. Having gained control of the ship, where would you take her? To France, perhaps?
You will not be surprised if I do not answer.
You don't have to,
said Colborne, pulling from his desk a letter.
There are many things you don't have to tell me, for they are all in here.
Colborne pushed it towards him, but he knew it to be Lutyens' letter before it was in his hand. Under the influence of drugs, he had told the surgeon of HMS Brilliant everything about himself and his past. The letter had been the surprise result. Addressed to the man's father, it was a plea that the pastor of the Lutheran Church should use his influence with royalty to get lifted the warrant for sedition that kept Adam Pearce out of Britain, a reprieve that would grant freedom to John Pearce as well. How in God's name had he got that? Gerson's name and face sprang into his mind again. Why had he ever gone to the bother of saving the bastard's life?
I return to you your property with a sincere apology for reading what was quite obviously private correspondence. Believe me, I did so from the best of motives.
Would that be self-preservation?
You are angry, and you have the right to be, but it will not surprise you to know that I have the right to do what I have done, and in reading it I have discerned your purpose. It may seem strange to you to hear me say that I am a happier man knowing who you are, in knowing that I was right about your dissimilarity to your fellows.
So now all your problems are solved?
Well, they could be. I could have you in chains, then hand you over to the port authorities to do with you what they wish. I hope it comes as no surprise to you that I would find such an action unpalatable.
Colborne grinned again and picked up the coffee-pot. From above their heads both men could hear the sounds of a ship about to moor. It was a telling notion of how much Colborne feared Pearce that he was not on deck to supervise it.
But that does not answer my dilemma. I cannot let you, a common seaman, off this ship, and I cannot keep you, an uncommon one, on board. I will not, in all conscience, hand you over to the authorities, because I, like the fellow who wrote your letter, do not believe a man should be condemned to prison for merely speaking his mind. I am reluctant to gift you to some other captain, for they would be bound to ask me why. Imagine if they were told and took you, how they would react to your behaviour. I doubt you'd survive a month.
There are laws against killing people, even sailors.
And there are captains who know how to circumvent them. It is we who write up the story, Pearce, and no Admiralty clerk is going to overly inquire about a name that says beside it in the log, died in the execution of his duties.
Pearce was wondering what price Gerson had extracted for his thieving, but he would not ask because he knew that Colborne would not tell him. I am grateful for the coffee and for the return of my letter. I dare say you wish from me a promise that I will desist.
I would like it, but somehow I doubt I would get it, and it is the measure of the respect in which I hold you that I would be disappointed if you made it. For, to return to where we started, it would be a lie.
Then why all this? Demanded Pearce, lifting Lutyens' letter. The coffee, the intimacy.
Well, it is pleasant to have someone of equal wit to talk to.
Colborne saw Pearce's colour rise as he became angry, and he spoke quickly to subdue him.
You need to get ashore, do you not?
More than that.
Tell me.
Pearce waved the letter.
There's not much that is not in here. My father is sick. He is in a country going from bad to worse. I need to get him out. The rest will have to be taken care of when that is accomplished. Then I have the solution.
Which is? That grin again.
I intend to rate you as a midshipman.
It was amazing how, in those few simple words, the case was altered. All the things that would damn Pearce ashore, the gait of a man new from the sea, those ingrained hands black with tar, the way the weather had coloured his face, would become part of his defence against crimps, all for the addition of a simple blue midshipman's coat.
"It is one of the quirks of the Navy," Colborne added, "that I am allowed within reason as many midshipmen as I want, and that it is I who appoint them. Of course it is not in the true nature of things a rank. It is merely a courtesy title for a youngster learning his profession. But it does mean that he is free to come and go from ship to shore much as he pleases, albeit he would have to have his captain's permission."
Why? Pearce asked the question because it was an outcome that had surprised him. In all his imaginings, in all those extrapolations of possible scenarios he had conjured up as a means of getting safely ashore, this one had never even been considered, and it was clear that Colborne knew it, for he was now grinning like a Cheshire cat.
"I thought I had explained, Pearce. I have a choice. I must, for my own sake, not yours, either beat you into submission or get you off this ship. You have been trying to get me to flog you for your minor infractions almost since you came aboard. So to do so would only play into your hands and alienate an already disturbed crew. If I remove you to another captain, will that magic away the harm you have done to relations between them and I? No, it may even make it worse. It would be seen as unjust, and you know how much sailors love to dwell on such things, be they real or imagined. We have taken a prize, we are coming into harbour, and right now the men are less disturbed. But I have no illusions about the Griffin or her capabilities. It may be some time before fortune favours us with the chance to catch another enemy vessel. I do not therefore anticipate a contented crew."
Pearce could not help himself. He had to ask. "Did Gerson come to you, or did you engage him to spy for you?"
"I needed to know about you and your motives. He is by nature curious. Let us say that our needs combined."
"And his reward?"
"Oddly enough, he did not ask for one."
"That is against his nature." Colborne gave him a knowing look.
"Can you not contemplate the notion that he hates you, Pearce?"
There was no arguing with that, even if he suspected it was not enough.
"I wonder if he will be surprised at the outcome." "Why should he be surprised? He has no idea of what is in your letter."
Pearce was sure Colborne was lying now. Gerson was not the type to meekly hand over such a thing and not want to know the contents. Very likely he had read it, which explained the close attention he had been paying the subject the last few days, but the result had been the opposite of that which he had sought. Pearce half wondered if he should feel aggrieved, for Gerson, no doubt encouraged by Colborne, had broken one of the most profound tenets of shipboard life. He had interfered with the possessions of one of his shipmates. Trust, in a crowded ship, was essential. Caught, he would have been lucky to survive the daily beating the rest of the crew would have administered.
"It was something of a relief to find that your actions were not personal."
Pearce was sure, as much as he was sure of anything, that had swayed the ship's captain. He was also sure that to acknowledge that act of generosity would be unwelcome. Colborne wished to be seen as clever, not kind.
"It will not surprise you to know that I do not have aboard a mid's uniform that would fit you. That must be purchased ashore."
Colborne paused then and looked hard at Pearce, who quickly smoked the reason. "I have money to pay for such things."
"Good.
Or at least I had. If Gerson has been rummaging in my belongings, I may not have everything that I once possessed."
"I doubt he's a thief,"
Colborne replied, looking away, then busying himself in his desk. That told Pearce he knew about his purse as well. If Gerson had not actually shown him, then he had told the captain. But that too must remain unsaid. As for Gerson being light-fingered, of that there was no doubt. If the purse was still intact, it would be because Colborne had insisted it be so. The patter of feet above their heads, the muffled shouts of command, were the sounds of the ship being secured to a buoy, while an anchor splashed over the stern, men hauling on a rope to pull them into their mooring, which would make taut the anchor cable, this while others clewed up the sails. Soon the crew would be prettying themselves up for the traders, whores, and tricksters who would come aboard to relieve them of what little coin they had. Perhaps more on this visit than the last, for those who preyed on the Navy would observe that, however battered she was, HMS Griffin had taken a prize, just as they would know, almost to the last farthing, long before the prize court pronounced a sum, how much, with its guns and men, it was worth. Colborne had a folded piece of parchment in his hand, which he flicked open. Even from the other side of the so-called cabin, in the dim light, Pearce could see the seal and ribbon affixed to the bottom, could imagine, perhaps, the florid signature which surmounted it. Should he offer Colborne money to pay for the document? For parchment was expensive.
"I have here a letter appointing you as a gentleman volunteer, a midshipman to this vessel. In it you will see that I require you to come aboard properly equipped, with all the necessary equipment to carry out the duties you will be required to perform."
Colborne handed it over. Pearce took it and tried to look at the words neatly written on the page, the opening line saying, "By the power vested in me." But he could not, for his eyes had filled with fluid. He was not crying, but he was, being overcome with such a compound of emotions, close to it.
"You are now officially Mr. Midshipman Pearce, a young gentleman, and I wish you joy of your elevation."
The ink-pot was pushed forward, and the sanding-pot reappeared along with a sheet of paper.
"I now require from you a letter asking to be allowed to go ashore to pursue a personal matter. I have already composed my written permission. You will need that if any zealous press gang or recruiting party questions you."
"Crimps?"
"Won't come near you in a midshipman's coat."
"You were so certain I would not refuse."
"Yes, very certain."
Colborne stood up, or rather crouched up, and grabbed his hat from the nail above his head, and his cloak from another driven into the hull.
"And now I must go up and see if your fellow mids have made a decent fist of berthing both our ship and the prize. Once I have done that, I must go ashore to report to the Commodore's office. You will accompany me."
"Will I be coming back?"
"The choice is yours, Mr. Pearce, not mine."
The lower deck was deserted, with all hands on the upper deck securing the ship, carrying out that multitude of tasks necessary to make Colborne happy. Many would have noticed Pearce's absence. They had last seen him go into the captain's quarters. What would they make of it? The more imaginative lot would have a vision of him skewered with Colborne's sword lying in a pool of blood, or lashed to a chair awaiting a file of marines to take him to the naval prison. The likes of Michael would be worried, while Gerson, no doubt, would be pleased with himself. His possessions, when he gathered them together from the hold, did not amount to much, being the same clothes in which he had originally been pressed. The coat that had once had a high collar, since ripped off, was musty from being folded for so long. A count-up of his money established that it was intact, nearly 30 guineas in total. If Gerson had helped himself to a golden coin, then he would have been welcome to it, for despite his malicious motive, Pearce knew that he had been the instrument of his release. His cambric shirt and thick winter breeches were musty too, for the lack of being aired, and there were his buckled shoes, greenish now, but of good enough quality to buff up once a little spit, blacking, and oil was applied. "Are you sound, John boy?" Pearce looked round to see Michael O'Hagan crouched down on the ladder, his wide Irish face concerned. They were still working on deck, where he too should have been, and the joy he felt turned sour. How was he to tell this man, a friend now risking punishment out of concern, who had done everything in his power to aid him in the suborning of the ship's crew, all designed to get the Pelicans off the ship as a group, that he had the means to depart, but alone? "More than sound, Michael." O'Hagan's eyes did not meet his. They were fixed on the empty ditty-bag, and at the clothes he had extracted, all laid out as if Pearce was about to change into them. It was clear that the Irishman was trying and failing to make sense of it.
"It would be a kindness to be after telling what's going on."
Elation at the prospect of release had made him forget about not just Michael, but Charlie and Rufus as well. In truth, Pearce was somewhat stunned by the turn of events, and had had no time to think matters through, especially as it related to the Pelicans. To have to explain now was bad, but he was aware that in his excitement he could have walked off the ship and into Colborne's boat in a continued daze without a word to his mates, and the knowledge that he might have done that made him feel like the lowest form of life. A scrub he might feel, but that did not alter the fact that he had an opportunity to fulfill his deepest wish, one that he was sure, if he explained, would be understood by Michael and the others. Gerson stole a letter from this bag.
"A bastard," spat Michael. "He'll feel my fist."
"Leave him be, for the sod has done me a favour. He gave it to Colborne."
"Mind out, fat arse,"
said a voice behind O'Hagan, identifiably Blubbers,
a remark that would normally get a jolly retort from the Irishman.
Not this time. Pearce could not see his face because he spun round to take on the insult, but he could hear him.
"Is it an early grave you be seeking, bastard?" "Hold on, Michael,"
said another voice, which Pearce recognised as that of Latimer.
"He was only making a joke."
"Michael,"
Pearce called, indicating he should vacate the companionway.
The crew was obviously finished on deck and eager to get below for their grooming.
That was another thought that had not occurred to John Pearce in his elation at Colborne's action. It was not just his pelicans who would wonder at his departure. They, so lately wound up like watch springs to a near state of mutiny, would hardly take kindly to what would look like an act of selfish personal advantage. Within a minute the lower deck was as crowded as it had ever been, filled with a buzz of noise so loud that Pearce would have had to bawl to tell Michael, now standing beside him but not looking at him, anything at all. Colborne came down the ladder, which killed off the noise, while doing nothing to make it any easier in the article of explanation. Head bent, he stopped in front of the pair.
"Are you ready to go ashore, Mr. Pearce?"
He could not reply, as Colborne, in a way that assumed agreement, went towards his cabin.
"Mr. Pearce, what in the name of Holy Mary is that about?"
Every eye was on him now, and few of them were friendly. Those not glaring at him were like young Rufus, confused, while Charlie Taverner was actually shocked. The problem of what to say was stopped by the reappearance of Colborne, ship's books and papers cradled in his arms. No fool, he sensed the atmosphere right away, and in truth it would have been impossible not to, given that it was so laden you could cut it with a knife.
"Mr. Pearce, you must make haste if you wish to go ashore, for I will not wait for you."
In the jumble of thoughts that filled John Pearce's mind then, one of them told him that Lieutenant Colborne had been exceedingly shrewd. How long had he had that letter? It could have been days, yet he had waited until they were berthing to have his interview, waited until Pearce, offered the thing he wanted most in the world, would have no time for explanation, no time to ask permission of his friends to accept. His walking off the ship now would be seen as an act of pure betrayal, killing two birds with one stone. Colborne was not only ridding himself of a pest, but undermining the message which had made the crew so fractious. He had, in truth, already done so, for even if Pearce declined his offer, in 2 one-sentence exchanges what trust he had built up among the men on this ship was broken. Colborne's words in his cabin had been soft soap, designed to get to just this point. He turned to speak to Michael, but the Irishman turned his back.
"I never thought the stink on this barkie could get worse, my boys, but it has. It's not just the timbers that are rotten."
Was Colborne smiling? Under his hat, which shaded his face, it was impossible to tell for sure, but Pearce had the distinct impression that it was so. Knowing that he had been outmanoeuvred made no odds. He had to make a decision whether to stay or go, to fulfill one duty, the one he had to this crew, or another, to his father. There really was no choice. This lot, barring shot, shell, and pox, would survive. Pearce jammed his clothing back into his bag, and as Colborne passed him, he followed the lieutenant up the companionway ladder. In the seething mass of emotions that assailed him as he hit the cold, fresh air, there was only one moment of relief. Gerson had not come below with the others, being one of those assigned the duty of hauling the prize alongside to be lashed off. When he saw Pearce trailing Colborne, carrying his ditty bags, his face showed momentary triumph, then confusion, given that Pearce was not under restraint. That turned to fury as Colborne said, "New to your duties, Mr. Pearce, you will not be aware that it is the custom for the senior officer to be last into a boat. So, as you are a midshipman and I a lieutenant, after you." The journey across the anchorage was horrible. He faced the men rowing the boat, who had seen him clamber down the side, ditty-bag in hand, and had heard, too, that last exchange. And now there was one of their fellow crewmen, and a landsman to boot, not hauling on an oar as they were, but sitting in the thwarts with the captain for all the world like an officer. The desire to challenge Colborne, to get him to admit that he had set out not only to get Pearce off the ship, but to undermine him, was powerful. But having been truly humbugged once, he decided against it, for he had a very strong feeling that if he was to try and hold a conversation that would be overheard by the nearest men on the oars, the lieutenant would turn it to his advantage. So he sat in silence, avoiding the eyes that were fixed on him, listening to Colborne's coxswain issue soft orders that turned the boat left and right through the shipping that filled the anchorage, unable to hear the whispered exchanges between the oarsmen, all of which he knew to be about him. Jumbled thoughts went from anger to despair, the former an attempt at justification which demanded to know why it was he who had to lead men to something they should aspire to and achieve themselves. The latter the certain knowledge that human nature was not designed that way. Men needed to be led, for good or ill. He had set himself to do just that, and walked out on the responsibility he had created. It was a relief to reach the shore and to step onto dry land for the first time in 6 weeks, even if the earth seemed to move beneath his feet. Colborne was standing, legs well spread, showing the way to adjust. "Take your time, Mr. Pearce. Give it a moment, otherwise I assure you, if you seek to walk right off, you will take a most ignominious tumble, and that would never do. We can hardly have the ship's crew cackling at you, can we?" Damn the man, he is laughing at me. "Your ditty-bag, Mr. Pearce." The turn to take it from one of the boat crew was executed slowly. He reached out a hand for the canvas sack, which was released a split second before he grasped it, falling to the ground with a soft thud. Pearce started to bend down, only to hear Colborne's voice once more. "No, Mr. Pearce. You have a certain station now, so it behoves you to demand that sack be picked up and placed in your hand." Pearce did not stop and picked it up himself. Colborne added, as the sailor dropped back into the boat, "Insubordination comes so very naturally to you, does it not?" No reply came, so Colborne continued, "My first task is to report to the Commodore's office and hand in my logs and papers. I dare say, since Mr. Short has brought in that capture, small and damaged as it is, the great man will oblige me with a glass or two. Normally I would ask you to wait here, but I fear under present circumstances that would be unwise. Like as not, I would return to find you floating face down in the harbour." "You have had your fun, Mr. Colborne."
"A simple sir would suffice. And as for fun, Pearce, I think you have had quite a deal of that at my expense this last 2 weeks. Now let us be off. You will be quite safe outside the naval buildings, which will give you plenty of time to plan your next move."
"You could hand me over now, couldn't you?"
"Yes, I could. But it may surprise you to know that I meant some of what I said in my cabin. I, too, have taken part in discussions on the nature of liberty. I have even corresponded with people who have attended meetings where your father spoke, and they would, no doubt, tell me that he is an estimable man who does not deserve to be proscribed merely for holding radical sentiments, just because madness has replaced sense across the Channel. As for the ship and my career in the Navy, I have done what I had to do, and if I seem to have taken pleasure in it, you must allow me that, for it is no more than a release from a period of anxiety that both those things were about to be taken from me. I will not betray you, for I was brought up to keep my word.
Thank you, sir. Back aboard Griffin, the mood was sombre. The men changed into the best shore-going rig, even although they would not set foot on land, but they did so in a muted way, with none of the joviality that normally attended such an occasion.
"He's gone and left us high and dry," said Rufus, "ain't he?"
"He has that, Rufus," Charlie replied, "and after all we've been through together. I never thought I'd live to see the day."
That brought a halt to the thoughts that Michael O'Hagan was harbouring, a mixture of hurt and anger. As a man, he reckoned himself too trusting, but he had decided long ago that it was better to be that way than forever suspicious. The trust had been abused before, but he could recall no time in the past when he had felt as let down as he did now. In the few weeks he had known John Pearce, he had come to think of him as a close friend, the kind he had not had since childhood, and right now, because he knew the reasons he was so desperate to get off the ship, there was room to forgive him for going. But there was no room to forgive Pearce for not explaining.
Damnation to the rest of the crew, but he should have told him what was afoot. "Just goes to show," Charlie added, "that in this life it don't do no good to trust anyone."
Michael glared at him and recalled that as a customer in the Pelican he had not much liked Charlie Taverner, and that was for his smarming ways as much as anything else. On top of that was the fact that Charlie, like the rest of his mates, rarely had any money, and he was always trying to part from their coin those who had some. Michael worked hard all day, a sinker paid good money to dig deep ditches and shafts, often up to his knees in freezing mud and slime, and at night he drank what he earned. If he woke in the morning with nothing left in his pockets, it made no odds, for another day's work would set him up again. But he did have difficulty in recalling what had taken place the night before, and he suspected that sometimes Charlie had taken advantage of his inebriation. On top of that, there had been a serving girl called Rosie that Michael was sweet on, a girl Charlie was always trying to steal away.
"There's a reason," Michael said.
"Course there is, Michael. He got the chance to look after himself, and he took it."
"Why don't you tell them?" asked Gerson, who had come close enough to hear. "Tell them that your sainted friend is a man who has betrayed his country as well as his friends."